we're live.
Welcome to a very special Misfire. I think it's special in that it has some structure and we're not wasted.
Yet.
Yet.
Let's see. We're going to talk about a hot button, hot topic issue in today's discourse, guns and gun control. All of us here have varying degrees of experience with firearms. Genevieve being, I guess, the least experienced. Because
correct.
You've only shot. I'm just basically a hunter. But I own hunting utilities. But some of the other people in the room have different levels of exposure. Just before we get into it, I don't know. We're going to discuss a possible solution that our special guest has here. There's probably going to be a lot of question asking because we all don't know the same thing, and that's totally cool. We'll go just as slow as anybody needs to go. There aren't any dumb questions. We're just trying to have a discussion so that everybody can be more informed. And any listeners out there, we're trying real hard to not make this a circle jerk for people who already have knowledge on guns, which hopefully Genevieve feels empowered to ask a lot of questions and keep us from our usual video game / gun / whatever we all know about circle jerk.
I think I'm going to play devil's advocate and play the role of a deer, actually, for this podcast.
That is a poor decision in this room.
So
I'll just start smashing into the mics randomly.
I'm going
and then
to
staring.
I'm
and
going
running
to.
away.
I'm actually going to hand this Misfire over to Jake. Jake, you have a guest here if you want to introduce him.
Yeah, definitely.
And you take the reins because this is your guy's brainchild here. So,
So I have my buddy Tim here, and we go back a long ways. Just a little bit of preface. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Tim, but if not for your college graduation party, I would not have met Russell, and therefore would likely not have moved onto Price Street here in Westchester and met Frank, a regular on the show, as well as my other roommates there, as well as my new coworkers and my new job, Chris, who used to be such a coworker. You're kind of an unknown hinge into my life in Westchester.
I was an unwitting domino.
Yes, an unwitting domino for sure.
All right.
So for what it's worth, I
that?
thank you for that, and we're very happy to have you here. You have I think like many of us in the room are something of a firearms hobbyist. An enthusiast?
I actually have a FFL. I have a federal firearms license.
Oh, no shit. Okay.
Yes. So that is why I'm neck deep in the paperwork, and that's where my problems are.
What does that mean?
Federal firearms license, essentially what that is you get it's somebody who can actually procure firearms from manufacturers, as well as actually I have a importer license and I have a manufacturing license. We haven't done anything with those. But basically the average citizen can't go out and just buy a gun from somebody who makes one. You need to have a federal firearms license to be able to get something from a manufacturer. That's the main difference. The federal FFL, they're responsible basically handling a lot of the paperwork. They're the intermediary for the ATF, and they are basically the people who track the inventory. We have to register essentially everything we bring in, bring out. We have to keep track of everything we bring in and bring out, as opposed to when you sell a firearm, particularly a rifle, to somebody, it kind of disappears for a while. But the FFLs have to keep track of everything. At any time, the ATF can just show up and be like, "Hey, we want to track your inventory, make sure you're doing everything square." So that's pretty much what an FFL is basically. And
so you're deeper in this than I was even aware when we invited you, which is cool.
There you go.
So that's a huge help. I'd like to go with our usual. I mean, normally we don't do this on Misfires, but let's go around and do the actual mic identifier for funsies. And for a change, I usually go last, but I'll start. We already kind of got into the weeds here, but before we go too much further, I'm Jake, and I'm running this damn show.
I'm Bill. I use guns to shoot deer.
I'm Chris. I am very new to the guns world. I'm pretty much my shooting experience is pretty much just handguns.
I am Genevieve, and don't own any guns, but I have shot some of, I think, Jake and Bill's guns. I like shooting range kind of places up at camp. Nothing, like no live targets or hunting, just sort of fucking around.
I'm Tim. I'm the guest. I have as I mentioned before, a federal firearms license. It's actually not my primary job. It's kind of a side thing I've been doing with my dad. I have a decent amount of shooting experience. I've studied a lot of military history, military arms, that kind of stuff. But I'm actually pretty green, I think, in the grand scheme of things compared to some other people. I wouldn't call myself a too much of an expert, but that's who I am.
Very nice. Yeah, so we pretty much, short of a professional firearms user like law enforcement, military.
Correct. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I wouldn't say I'm a
right. We have, but we have
professional in
otherwise
that
pretty
sense.
much the whole gamut. Total novice all the way up to, I guess maybe in terms of actually firearms usage, it might be a tie between you and I, Bill. I mean, I've never shot anything that moves, but maybe I've put more rounds downrange. I'm not sure.
I think with that binary trigger, I think you put more rounds down range.
Yeah. That we can get into that later. But yeah, I'm pretty excited for this. And the main impetus for inviting you on, Tim, was on Facebook. You had a very long but worthwhile post, kind of outlining the existing laws and around firearms regulation, as well as a pretty what I think is a unique policy prescription. I don't remember too much of it at the moment, I'm sorry to say, but
right.
I know a lot of it had. That's why you're here. A lot of it had to do with the reforming the background check system that's already in place to make it more effective.
Yeah,
and I'm sure there was other stuff involved as well.
That's kind of part one, and part two actually has to do with the layers and layers of bureaucracy we have already regulating the guns, and that's actually causing a drainage of both manpower and money that should be directed towards tracking down people who are actually a threat. And in the meantime, the ATF is, cataloging suppressors and all kinds of stuff that they really are absolutely wasting their time doing, instead of being out there, fighting bad guys, protecting people. So there you go.
What we certainly think of their job as being. So I guess I'll leave it to you then. You got a big old stack of paperwork there. I'm kind of curious where you want to start.
The stack of paperwork is... Honestly, it's more of
We're all taking a test.
It's more they're all taking a test. It's more of kind of just an example of the levels of complexity of things you have to deal with. Right here, I have these are two gigantic packets, and this isn't even what you need on the state level. If you were to get a rifle that has a barrel that's shorter than 16 inches, and that sounds ridiculous because. And it is ridiculous. Basically, it's silly, but it's kind of that complex. It's this complex pile of paperwork for something that simple, and I really question the logic in if someone's not qualified to own a 14.5-inch barreled rifle, why would you on earth want them to own a 16-inch barreled rifle? It seems like.
Okay, so just to pause, there's regulation on barrel length and whether or not you can what?
Yes, and this is where the complexity. This is why I have a pile of paperwork in front of me. There's this act passed in 1934, and it's been modified since, and it's been a little less restricted. Originally, it was 18.5, now it's 16, and that has to do with basically caliber upgrades. But it's called the National Firearms Act. And what I have here, to make things even worse, is an 18-page packet from the ATF's website defining specifically what are NFA-regulated items.
What does NFA regulated mean?
NFA regulated means anything that the ATF is basically in this packet that they classify as a NFA item, which means you need a tax stamp, which means you need that giant pile of paperwork I have sitting to my left. You have to pay a tax stamp. You have to wait a couple months as the ATF processes it. They run additional background checks. They run their own checks essentially. And then on top of that, you need a pile of approval paperwork to keep with you at all times when you have this NFA regulated item.
So the NFA is the National Firearms Act of 1934, was it?
Correct.
Guns that are regulated under that legislation.
Yes.
Guns and items.
Guns and items, because it's not just it's not just, and that's the craziness, is that it's not specific models of guns, and it's not even specifically machine guns. It's also things like
Well, hold on. I just want to work through our jargon a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So the NFA regulated, covered under legislation, National Firearms Act of 1934, that the ATF, which is Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is a 3-letter branch of the federal government, I guess, law enforcement body.
The Bureau, yeah.
Yeah.
Enforcement body.
And basically, this is defining what they have purview over under this specific legislation. So they're not limited in power just to what's covered under.
No. This is one piece of things that they have to worry about that I really feel is a waste of their time.
Okay.
And it also creates a very strenuous relationship between gun owners, particularly FFLs and the ATF. For instance, it's not a myth because I've seen it. The ATF will go around at a gun show and people in their ATF hats, and what they're doing is they're looking for violations. Now, when you think of something illegal happening at a gun show, you think, well, what's something that the public would basically somebody purchasing something without a background check, or
the gun show
someone
loophole.
selling, someone selling something under the table, because that's tempting to do because you have a lot of people and it's kind of an open market. That's the stuff you think the ATF would be looking for, but that's not what they spend their time doing. They spend their time with a tape measurer measuring barrel lengths for basically custom carbines and things people are selling.
What's a carbine? I'm sorry.
A carbine, it's just a rifle, essentially.
Okay.
I'm saying because there's a shorter rifle.
Yeah.
They'll measure and they'll say, okay, well, this thing, it's 16 inches, but is your flash hider welded on properly, welded and pinned?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very, very silly. Things like here we go, shotguns. The length of the shotgun barrel.
That one's 18 inches, right?
I think they have a limit of 18. So, and they have a picture of an example. Here's one that's 15 inches, because a criminal's really gonna not do that. But the only people they're stopping is basically just regular me and you from purchasing something that might be a little shorter and a little handier. Mm-hmm. And I just think
it seems like the rationale as far as barrel lengths are concerned had to do with concealability coming out of the Great Depression. And like when all these mafiosos and stuff were just cutting off. I mean, you think of Bonnie and Clyde and the BAR when they chopped the barrel lengths down.
Well, the problem was not that the concealability argument was something that has come up, but it's really not, because if that was the case, then handguns would be on the NFA, which handguns flatly are not, because it's not about the concealability. They also regulate the width of the bore. It's power, and the reason why they would do this is because basically your Bonnie and Clyde, your criminals, they would often take basically off the shelf weapons and they would just saw them off. So a sawed off shotgun, sawed off rifle, something like that, to make it a little more handy for getting in and out of cars. And it was an additional charge that they could throw on when they apprehended somebody. So if they apprehended somebody and they wanted to charge them as a bank robber, maybe the bank robbery charges didn't stick if they haven't robbed the bank yet. But you can then say, oh, look, he's got a cut weapon. We can now charge him because it looks like he's intending to, he's got a short gun. He's intending to rob the bank. It's the basically, you have a couple ounces of weed on you. Mm-hmm. But it's like, he's got that on there. He must be up to something else.
Yeah, he's intent to distribute, right?
Correct. And they say basically, if you have a short gun, of course you're going to be the person who's going to be robbing a bank.
So, from my level of knowledge, whenever we talk about short barrels, it reminds me of some History Channel program that I saw on the Israeli Defense Forces. And I think that they have some level of trenches around Israel, and when they are fighting in there, they use Uzis, which have particularly short barrels. And really the only advantage that I've heard, aside from getting in and out of cars, is that the longer the barrel, the more difficult it is to quickly rotate.
There's different. And
to navigate through hallways and stuff, which is why they like
the caliber. But basically, what you're doing, you're shortening the barrel, you're decreasing the accuracy, you're decreasing the velocity in a lot of cases. But in exchange, you get it a little more handy.
Well, I'm trying to define what you mean by handy. Is really what I'm getting.
Yeah, getting in and out of a car, moving inside of a building, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And the reason why that flew in basically 1934 is because back then the standard military caliber or really the standard calibers were these big 30 caliber 30-06, which is, if you've ever seen a picture of it, it's it's a long. I mean, you're a hunter, so you know.
Right.
It's a massive round, and if you start shortening the barrel of that kind of rifle, you really greatly decrease the ballistics. And who would want to do that, right? Except you're a criminal. Well, now we're in the age where the bullets are much smaller and less lethal, arguably, and 14.5 is kind of your standard carbine length.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't do that now. So that's
when we're saying caliber, we're talking about the width of the bullet, the actual projectile itself.
I'm loosely using that to say like the type of bullet.
Okay. Well, if
caliber,
if,
your
if
9mm, your
Caliber generally
5.56
refers to the width of the bore, right, or the bullet. Generally speaking. So when we say 30 caliber, that comes out to about 9mm, and you think 9mm, you think handgun. Well, all that's speaking to in this case is the width.
Yeah.
So a 30-06 is a big honking rifle round that just puts gigantic holes in things. It's not really mainstream anymore because it was replaced by the 308, and there's a whole history to that.
Yeah.
But that we don't need to get into here. But
the bullet's actually the same. It's the
it's the powder charge.
Yeah. Casing.
But so there's it's easy to get stuck in all these different technical terms, but when for right now we're just talking about at the time, the Bonnie and Clyde, again, kind of a one-off example, but they definitely spoke to a trend in the Depression of we need money, the black market's booming, so let's get stupid.
This it's just one of the things that I always explain to people who aren't familiar with firearms, and I think it helps them understand. When we say 7, 9, 10 millimeter, we're talking in millimeters, the width of the bullet.
Right. And
there are certain implications that are carried along, basically two other factors, I think, whether or not it's a pistol or rifle round.
That makes a huge
tremendous difference.
Yeah. And, well, I forgot the other thing. Well, anyway, okay, whether it's pistol rifle round and the width of the bullet, there are certain implications that go along with it. Now, if we say something like a 22 or a 308, we're thinking of, or 17, which is a neat little round in my opinion. We're thinking of literally a decimal point and then those numbers that we're saying.
It's decimals of an inch.
You're right, and they are hundredths of an inch, whereas millimeters are the size of millimeters. Like 22, 45, they're hundredths. Or hundredths of an inch. So,
the point being, just like everything else that one might measure in terms of distance, bullets are also they switch between metric and English, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a mess.
It is a bit of a mess. So when but just to give you a frame of mind in your head, if you've ever seen a 9mm pistol cartridge, in terms of its diameter, it's the same as something like a 30-06, which is a big honking rifle round. But it's just one variable in the greater equation of ballistics and the firearm itself. So when the NFA came along, and part of its stipulations were to discuss and enforce things like barrel length, it had to do with, well, why do you need this big honking rifle round in a rifle that you can, fire from your lap in a moving car without having the barrel sticking 3 feet out the window?
Yeah, that was the logic. Now, I don't agree with that, but that was kind of what allowed it to not get as much resistance. It was like, well, you shouldn't. There's no advantage. There's no reason somebody would want a really short 30-06 because it's uncomfortable and loud and inaccurate, unless you were getting in and out of a car, and if you're doing that, then it's like you're a bad guy. Right. So. I mean, I don't 100% agree with that logic, but it wasn't as big of a deal because if you were to go out and buy, even at the time, if you were to go out and buy like a Browning automatic rifle, it's 22-inch barrel, 20-inch maybe for the short version.
Weighs like 25 pounds.
Exactly, weighs 25. I mean, it's big, and you're just like, well, I'm not going to cut mine down. I don't care. I don't want that. But there's other problems with that because what they also attached, you can't put a stock on a pistol. Because now that's an NFA item.
Now it's a short barrel rifle.
Now it's technically a short barreled rifle.
Right.
Which
a stock being just an attachment on a firearm that allows you to brace it against your shoulder,
correct,
providing more stability.
Which the funny part about that is you say that, and that's not actually technically even the definition.
Oh,
they decide what a stock is.
So it could be anything.
It could be it's whatever they decide the stock is. Because for example, an arm brace that is legal, which is supposed to wrap around your wrist. It's long enough to put against your shoulder. That's not illegal. Is that technically a stock? I don't know.
It's a major development in the last decade of
and I would say semantically, I'd say that is a stock.
Mm-hmm.
No, do I want that legally to be a stock? No, because I think that rule is dumb.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the problem, is you get sucked into it and you're like, oh well, this is technically, and the ATF spends all their time, or not all their time, but they spend a significant amount of time classifying and dealing with this and deciding what items are restricted and which barrel length is too long, and whether they can charge somebody for having something that's too short. What is intent? Do you own a short barrel, and do you intend to put that on a lower that's technically a rifle lower, even though it could also be a pistol lower?
Lower being the simply the bottom half.
Yeah, like literally the bottom half
of the assembly of a firearm.
Like you take something like a platform like an AR-15, for example. That's very modular, and that bottom piece can be a rifle, it can be a pistol. It could be a very long rifle. It could be a very short pistol. Or it could be a completely different caliber. It can be converted to. It could just be being used as a trigger. I mean, there's a lot of we saw that he was shooting that belt fed, and I think the ejection is. It doesn't even use the mag well.
Right.
At that point,
it's just being used as a trigger in a hand.
Exactly. It's just a hammer at that point.
Yeah.
It's nothing. Or you haven't fully milled it out, and it's just a block of aluminum, and they can basically say, well, you have this pistol upper that could fit on this rifle lower. You might be intending to make a short-barreled rifle. And they spend a lot of time thinking about these things and fighting legal cases and dealing with this. And it's like, why? Who does that benefit?
So I've sort of derailed you into defining stuff. We won't have to do this again later in the show, but when we diverted it, we were talking about gun shows. So I didn't know if you wanted to continue down that path.
Well, what I was just saying is my example with the gun shows is just that shows the strenuous relationship that the ATF has with these FFLs, and it's adversarial, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't have an adversarial relationship with an agency that is supposed to be protecting us from bad guys getting stuff, but it's not. They're protecting you from yourself getting a rifle that's too short, or a shotgun that's too short, or something the barrel diameter is too wide. It's now a destructive device because it's
a whole other. Is that the NFA or is that
that's NFA? Yeah, NFA. And that's what I mean. Like it's very it stops you, the law-abiding person, the guy with the FFL, the guy who just wants. The grandma who just wants a little pistol caliber carbine to keep, beside her bed so that somebody doesn't break in at night. And that we got to make sure that barrel length is the correct length, is long enough. Or if it's a pistol, we got to make sure it doesn't technically have a stock on it. And then the worst part about that is that now not only do they, it's basically, that's already a silly law. Now when somebody wants to go get it, they have to go get permission with a tax stamp and with this pile of paperwork from the ATF, who then process it, and they spend all their manpower and all their time basically approving to say, okay, well, this guy's okay to have a rifle that's with a barrel that's 2 inches shorter than the one he was going to get anyway.
What is a tax stamp?
What is a tax? It's basically just a piece of paper that says you've paid the ATF and the federal government a certain amount of money.
It's not an insignificant amount, correct?
No, it's in the hundreds.
200.
It's 200. Yeah. Well, I think certain things are like 400 or something. But
I never encountered them, but from what I've seen,
most of the time it's about 200.
If you want a suppressor or a short barrel rifle or shotgun, it's 200.
Yeah.
If you want to. This kind of hints on another ban we're going to talk about, the 86 automatic weapons ban. If you anything pre that ban, you can still transfer. Those transfers, $200 tax stamp.
Yeah.
Then there's something called an any other weapon, or an AOW, which has a $5 tax stamp.
Yeah, that's
which is a whole other bag of silliness.
And that's the craziness about this is that why are they doing this? Because it's a matter of it's you're the one they're making sure can't get certain things, not a bad guy, not somebody who's a criminal who doesn't care. It's you,
But
specifically you.
but
Okay.
but
All right.
if everybody in this room can't get that short barrel gun that's really easy to hide, that means that some criminal can't break into our house and steal it. We can't sell it without doing research. Less of them around means less criminals have an opportunity to get it, right? Isn't that how it works?
Except no. And I mean, in a certain sense, yes, there is a dry up of supply when something just simply doesn't exist. I mean, that's why you don't see a whole lot of gun crime in Japan. We completely disarmed them when we were occupying them. So, there's not a whole, there's still plenty of crime, plenty of murder, plenty of suicide, but there's not specifically as much gun crime. But that's a very unique situation. United States, I mean, we've got, they estimate, 300 million guns, something like that, like a gun per person, pretty much. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that once you buy one, you end up buying a couple.
Mm-hmm.
But it's nothing's going to stop a criminal from making a shorter rifle or sawing off their shotgun. And personally, I don't care, because they're going to do that anyway, and I would rather have a nice short handy weapon to defend myself.
I think I have a question. Kind of related, because I know I've asked it before, but what is the actual benefit of having like a sawed-off shotgun? Why do people do that? Is it concealability, or is it?
Well, most of it has to do with the handiness. Technically, the spread is wider. The shorter the barrel, the less tight of a spread you have.
Okay.
On a shotgun.
On a shotgun.
So
now,
it's a little more dangerous, or a little more.
No, it's
widespread.
Well, it's technically, if you want to argue, it's less dangerous, because your likelihood of getting hit with multiple pellets goes down.
So we talked about this the other day.
The ammo has much more to do with your shotgun's effectiveness than the
barrel length.
Specific barrel length. There's so many other factors. It's just one piece of the puzzle. But a short little handy shotgun is pretty nice for home defense because it doesn't overpenetrate, but you can't do it because the ATF says those are particularly bad. It's because it's one thing to murder somebody, but if you murder somebody with a short barrel shotgun, that's whoa.
That's double murder.
Whoa, that's
double murder.
We're not pirates here, people.
It sounds
I
like
know.
it's harder to kill someone though. If
yeah, I mean
shots
at distance, yeah. I mean,
okay.
Also you're inducing, especially if you modify a weapon, you're creating all kinds of possible malfunctions, and also the recoil's worse, so you can't necessarily handle it as well.
Okay.
That's the silliness of it is but they spend their time thinking about these things, and they say, okay, well, we're going to start measuring barrel lengths and making sure you have a tax stamp and permission if you want to have this. And it's like the criminal nobody commits a crime with an NFA registered weapon because the criminal just doesn't care. They're not going to be concerned with the fact that the ATF says it's illegal because they're already doing something illegal. It just affects you, the regular average Joe. Mm-hmm. It's just they're spending their time monitoring you when
specifically
they should be,
Bill and just
specifically Bill.
Just
Bill.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the discussion that I often find myself in when talking about firearms. And I love to hunt. It's part of my culture. I mean, I'm Pennsylvanian, a lot of family from central Pennsylvania, that kind of thing. But I am a staunch supporter of providing the means to individuals to defend themselves. And this is it. I often end up getting asked questions, what good is this weapon, at all? And I say, well, in a multiple assailant scenario, in a home defense, and that's sort of what we're talking about now, where I think it would be really, really practical to have a handier weapon that doesn't necessarily shoot over range like a shorter shotgun, because you don't need it. Because in your home, you're shooting what, 25 feet?
Tops.
What you do need is a reliable firearm that, I don't want to say enhances, degrades your ability to shoot accurately less than something else. So when we're talking about like the spread of a shotgun shoots small metal balls instead of one big one. And when they come out of the gun, they spread out. The wider the spread, the more space it covers in front of you, the shooter. So if you're standing in your house and there's a person in front of you and you're shaking and you're nervous and you shoot something with a wider spread, you have a better chance of hitting them. and that means a better chance of neutralizing whatever threat that you decided to use.
Hollywood sort of
it's
overstates
still
that effect.
marginal because you're talking the difference between a 2-inch spread and a 3-inch spread.
Oh,
you're talking like 15 yards inside a house. It's your aiming is much more important, and the handiness of it being short is more important than actually any kind of spread benefit you get from the barrel being shorter. But you can mitigate that by choosing better ammo. You can choose 12 pellet or something like that, something that's closer to birdshot, kind of splitting the difference. Then you will get better spread, which is kind of what I recommend. Is not that I'm saying use birdshot, but I like the idea of not busting a gigantic hole through the wall and hurting somebody on the other side. So if you've got something like 12 pellet, or I think they make something called tactical buck. It's 9, but they're lighter, and you get. But that's the thing is I can't choose for you.
Mm-hmm.
The ATF, well, they want to choose. They want to tell you what you can do.
Yeah, ultimately, there a lot of these things that sound spooky, scary. There are practical uses for. Sort of what I was trying to.
The big one I hear a lot is, especially with this most recent school shooting in Florida and others like it that have involved semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15.
Mm-hmm.
Is what possible application could this have in a home defense situation? And it makes my brain explode because, okay, there's definitely concern. We were just talking about over-penetration. There's concern about the 223 or the 5.56 bullet.
Well, you can get rangeable too. I mean, there's ways around it.
Exactly.
There's always ways around it.
Exactly. Well, why do you need a 30-round magazine? Well, multiple assailants, right? It's happened. It happened just a few days after the shooting in Florida. There was a fella, I forget where, who there was a drive-by on his house in a relatively nice-looking suburb, and I don't know why, but I think it was 3 assailants and a driver, or maybe it was 3 people total in the car, and they just started to light up his house, and he came up with an AR-15 and hit all 3 of them in a moving car, and 2 of them died, and he didn't get hit once because they were using handguns. So there are it is an effective tool for these situations.
I think. And I think that's one of the other things is that it's very, very hard to impress upon somebody who says, well, you don't need this big, scary thing because they don't think they need it. And they don't think, therefore, they don't need it. Therefore, they don't think you need it. And you're crazy because, well, if there just wasn't guns in the first place. And it ends up being very circular. But this is what I say when somebody says that. I say, okay, let's take this to the logical conclusion. There's probably 30 million AR-15s. And if you want to include all semi-auto of similar assault weapon platforms, you're well above 50 million. You could be up to 100 million. We don't even know. So we have an undisclosed amount of these scary black rifles from anywhere from 30 million to 100 million, right? How many crazy dudes, like crazy people who shouldn't have guns, are out there? And do we want to spend our time as law enforcement, our money, our time, our politicians, all this stuff, our effort, tracking down these 30 million plus magical, deadly, super deadly guns? Or do we just want to have those same people, focus on the handful of screwballs who are actually the actual threat? I mean, especially after Parkland, when you see they knew with this guy. I mean, they 100% knew that there was something up here, and then the levels of failure at Parkland were just unbelievable.
Let's unpack that because I think you have a better understanding of it than me. Tell us how the system let us down here.
Oh, on what level?
All of them, please.
Start at the lowest and work your way up.
All right.
Listen, man.
I think the. I'm gonna. There's. Okay, what the easiest is school physical security. All right. They have one armed guard who's a sheriff's deputy protecting a massive outdoor complex. Okay, I argue against that, especially when you've got children. You don't have just, if you want to protect them, that's not how you do it. But fine, they had a walled complex. Smart. They had the gate open up 20 minutes beforehand because, for convenience factors, and the guard was not there. The sheriff's deputy who was supposed to be there was not there. So this kid walked in and he did what he was going to do because they didn't have security at the most logical post. And then on top of that, once the bullets started flying, the guy completely failed to do his job. Clearly wasn't the kind of person who should have been wearing the badge if he wasn't willing to go in when that mattered. So that's one failure. The other failures are you've got this kid being called, basically the police being called to this kid's house, and the kid's saying things like, I'm hearing voices in my head that are telling me to kill my family. I'm hearing voices in my head to tell me to kill police. I'm hearing voices in my head that are telling me to shoot up a school. And nothing is done. And this stuff gets passed on to the FBI, who then the FBI doesn't pass it on to the local office. And it's kind of like every point of that chain, nobody passed on information, where they did nothing. And there's also the, corruption in their school district with the, we're not gonna, we want to make sure our arrests are low, so we're not gonna, report this. This guy called, this kid called for help how many times? Basically,
I have no idea.
Oh, you don't know?
I do not know.
The amount of times the shooter essentially did things. He's out back hurting animals. He was shooting chickens in his backyard. Like, that's already a major firearms violation. You can't just do that. And nothing was done about it. And basically enough warning signs went up where if you look at everything from the sheriff's department to the school district to the I think the local police essentially is run by essentially the sheriff's department or something like that. There's this kind of a weird relationship. They had gotten, I think, 45 calls. There's so many levels of failure. And on top of all these other crazy ass things, and this is where I kind of was getting into the background check stuff. I don't think it would have helped in this case because I think the local police were that incompetent. But I think that he goes to purchase a firearm, right? And it goes to the FBI, and the FBI checks up, and they try to figure out whether this guy's an upstanding citizen or not. That's what the NICS, National Instant Check System. It's actually a very, very good system in concept, and in practice, when it works, it's great. I've worked at gun stores, and it's tedious, but it's not the worst thing in the world. And I do like the idea of basically, especially as an FFL, that I have a way that I can say, this person I'm selling to is in good standing. I don't have to worry about it. But that system only works when people pass on information. And in Parkland's case, they did not pass on the information. To the FBI.
From what you're explaining, it and not even touching on sharing information. I didn't know that it was a firearms violation to shoot chickens.
What?
Yeah, I believe for living animals, it has to do with what's game and what's considered a pest, and chickens don't fall on there.
And here's the thing. We do have so many laws that could, like, if that guy had gotten jammed up for that, he would have been involved in the legal system, and that has with it. It gives the regulating body so much more ability to investigate and monitor and mitigate different problems. One of the things I was reading was the FBI looked into a username that was reported that said they were going to shoot up a school, and they're like,
yes, it was his name.
Yeah, and they basically said, oh, we didn't have enough to go on, but somebody had enough to go on because he was already breaking a law.
Correct.
He was already breaking one.
But the local, and this is where the local police, or really the sheriff's department, was not passing on that information federally because they wanted to keep their numbers a certain amount. And they did this kid no service. This kid needed help. He was mentally deranged. He needed help. And they didn't give it to him. And that's the thing, his adopted parents died. It was kind of the perfect storm of people passing the buck. I think Parkland's a little special because the level of incompetence of that sheriff's department was. It sounds like it was something. It sounds like it's something written by like a right wing. Pro-gun like fantasy, like where like the government lets you down on every single level and everybody's corrupt, and then like even to the point where like the shooting's happening and they don't go in to go save the kids, And it sounds like a joke, and it's just every level of it is.
Here's a question I've had about the Parkland incident. He initially started firing outside the building.
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Because I was curious.
It's not clear.
I was curious when, because that's what I was reading in some of the initial reports. If when he entered school grounds, was the weapon already visible?
Oh yeah.
So somebody outside looking at him would have seen before he entered the building that he had a firearm.
Well, there's basically it's a gated complex, and he gets dropped off by the Uber. And I assume he probably kept it in a bag because the Uber guy probably wouldn't have delivered somebody with an AR to a school.
Right.
But he basically gets out of the Uber. The gates open 20 minutes beforehand. Now, he knows this because he went to the school, but also he could have just observed this. Anybody could have observed this. So this is when the gate opens. And he just walked in. And once he walked in, it's assumed at some point he took out the weapon. And the buildings aren't locked. And basically all they needed was a guard there to question. Like, why does this guy have his giant long thing in a case that...
Well...
Or just here's the worst part. The deputy who's there was the what are they called? Not the service agent. There's a name for it. Like he's like this guy assigned to that school.
Mm-hmm.
He knew this kid by name, and they told him like, "Hey, this kid's gonna come back and shoot up school. Like he's a problem." And so he even knew who this kid was, and like he just wasn't. But it doesn't mean anything if you're not at the gate when it opens up.
Right, and I think part of this. Explanation almost does a disservice to the point that I'm thinking you're trying to make, because when you give all this information to somebody who does want to take away access to firearms for citizens, what they're hearing instead is, we have all these measures in place and they're not working. The only thing we can do is to get rid of the guns.
And which is when I point to, okay, let's take that to its next logical conclusion, which is basically there's 300 million weapons. Is it worth law enforcement's time to track down every law-abiding citizen's arms and either register or confiscate them? Is that worth the physical time and effort versus just doing your goddamn job and stopping the crazy-ass kid?
Well, in the response that I would imagine is it worth 17 children's lives? And they go, yes.
And then I just say, well, that's patently absurd, because it's one is tenable. I think the idea of reforming mental health and tracking down crazy people and stopping them is tenable. Why do I think it's tenable? Because we've done it before. Back when machine guns were legal, this stuff didn't happen. And now that we have, basically Columbine, the height of weapons restrictions in the United States, the assault weapons ban was in effect. You couldn't buy a new machine gun. You couldn't buy an AR-15. You couldn't do any of this stuff. And that's when the school shootings have started. And it's gotten kind of fluctuated in terms of, there's a lot of arguments about whether mass shootings have gone up or down. But this is kind of a unique problem now, where people go in and they shoot up these gun-free soft targets. And people say, well, you know what the problem is we need to make things like they were when these things started. And I just imagine law enforcement trying to track down individuals and people who are not threats rather than dealing with the people who are threats.
A little bit of an aside. Can you describe what is meant by like soft or a hard target? Some people don't know.
A hard target is basically a hard target would be a police station. Everybody's walking around with guns and they're all trained and they're all ready, and you'd be, unless you're Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator, don't go near a police station unless you want to die, and if you're trying to actually hurt people. A soft target is someplace like a gun-free zone where there's a lot of defenseless people who are not likely armed or illegally barred from being armed. And that's pretty much a school, and that's why you see pretty much 97% of number fluctuates, but it's well over 90% of mass shootings, which just means basically more than 4 people killed with a firearm, are in places that are gun-free legally.
In school, one of the things I studied was like security and risk analysis. We talked a lot about hard and soft targets. Mm-hmm. When I think of like a hard target, I think of a courthouse.
That's probably a better example,
right?
Actually.
And when I think of a soft target, I think of anywhere else that's not, that they have no measures to combat a bad actor.
Malls, concerts, nightclubs.
Right. And we've seen them. And part of the issue in our study, well, in my study that I learned was you can harden soft targets, but what that tends to do is simply push these bad actors to other soft targets. Now, in the example of a school, if we hardened all the schools, would that remove the ability of bad actors to commit these shootings? No, but it would push it away from these kids that are, you know what I mean? Like it would push them to something else.
Exactly, and that's the thing is that if they there's going to be less of them if they have a chance of meeting resistance. There's a number of stories of people they try to shoot up the mall that's gun free, but there's some off duty cop, and then they end up, oh my god, I'm getting shot at, and they off themselves.
Yeah, that happened at a Walmart. Concealed carry owner fired at a couple who were saying like some wild shit. They come in, they start shooting at the Walmart. He shoots at them. He's killed, but then they go in an aisle and they kill themselves.
Yeah, it's bizarre, and I think getting inside the heads of mass shooters is kind of its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the point being is like, if you don't want the children to get killed, then you shouldn't like open. It's a hen house with open, with a revolving door, basically.
Part of the problem that I've run into talking to people about this, because for me, I think in a certain way, and it's okay, if we want X, then let's do Y. You know what I mean? If we want to stop people from entering the building and committing these acts, let's make it so that they can't get into the building. That's like an immediate fix to me. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the stuff seems more long-term, systemic solutions down the road. But right now, let's harden these soft targets.
I mean, I don't have a solution for the culture that's producing these whack jobs. And I don't know. And there's so many complicated things. But in terms of like physical security of the school, I can tell you what to do.
So part of it, and without mentioning the name of our school, part of the problem that I get from those people who don't like that idea is that they don't want kids to feel like they're going to school in prison. Because in their minds, a secure school is like another secure place that they can think of, which is prison. And I usually counter with,
prison.
Does a courthouse feel like a prison? When I'm in a courthouse, I just feel safe, And I think, I told this to you, Jake, a little while ago, and you had some feelings on our school that we went to already.
It already felt like a prison in its way.
Right?
I didn't feel like, there weren't armed guards or nothing. But, it's very regimented. It's very, be here at this time, and if you're not, people are going to hear about it, and you or your parents are going to be questioned. Simple shit, playing hooky, doesn't fly anymore, right? Adding armed guards would not exacerbate that sentiment, really. Not for now. It's been 10 years since I was in high school, but even so, like, yeah, I in the late 2000s when I graduated, I mean, school shootings were still a thing, and always being something of having something of a self-defense mindset. Every time another one came on the news, I mean, I was running in my head the permutations of what I would do. And I'm like, and one of the things I would land on in those little head simulations, that head cannon, was it'd be really nice if there were some armed guards out front.
It'd be nice if there was, I don't know, any response. I think that's not.
They taught us to huddle against the wall or under desks or something.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, okay, no, armed guards out front, and then teach me, the kids, how to throw desks at the door. All right, how to rush. If it comes down to it.
I never understood the make sure you're as far away from basically being able to do anything about it as possible.
The other thing that I hear is, I say, well, and they go, well, more police means more kids arrested in schools for being kids. And
I never heard that.
I hear it a lot.
I have heard that, but
the other thing is
torn on really the validity.
Well, I mean, even if you didn't like the idea of having people with arrest power in a place that you're trying to harden, well, get guards there who don't have arrest power. Their only job is to react to security threats. That's it.
Bouncers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sophisticated bouncers.
And
It'll feel like a nightclub.
Pretty much.
there's plenty. There are plenty of people who come from professions that we can vet to see whether or not they can be around kids who have the skill set to keep a building secure. And
I think the other thing is I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all for every school. But we tend to try to dictate that all the time from the federal level. They say, well, the solution is this. Maybe in one school, maybe it's not in another. I mean, because, for example, the arming teachers solution, and that's been very controversial.
I'm glad you brought it up because I was about to, yeah.
And I think a lot of, where we went to high school, no.
Why?
No, because they're idiots. but here, but my dad's a teacher. My dad's, my dad could CCW. He teaches at in
CCW. What's that?
Steel carry, but like he teaches at a school in it's a Catholic school in Philadelphia, and that's probably a very good solution. They've got a lot of ex-cops, ex-military, that kind of stuff, and it's not like they walk around strapped. Just something to conceal.
Well, part
yes
of
or no?
Part of the thing that has really bothered me about this proposed solution of quote unquote arming teachers is the misrepresentation of the actual proposed solution.
Yeah.
Aside from Dontron all the way at the top talking about giving bounties to people for carrying their weapons as teachers, which I think is a horrible idea. The actual discussion that I've heard is allowing people who already have a concealed weapons permit to carry their weapons while they are teaching seems really good to me. And I don't have the numbers exactly in front of me, but I've read up on it. Some of the most law-abiding citizens in the United States right now are those who have a concealed weapons permit.
CCWs are by far the only second, these basically in terms of like criminality, like they're the lowest.
Yeah.
Because if you commit a crime, you lose your CCW. And people who have CCWs generally don't want to lose it.
And here's the thing. The group of people who self-select to have CCWs have already selected to be amongst the most law-abiding, if not the most law-abiding, in the country. Now, if you were to add money as a motivator, you would change that self-selection process. But right now, those people are already some of the most law-abiding people we have. Why is it so preposterous to allow them the means to act in a situation like this in schools?
Well, I think you might be in a lot of ways violating their rights by not allowing them to be armed, by choosing for them. But I think it's a little more complicated. I think when you talk about somebody who's actually professionally trained as security, what they call Act 276, which is like a different, you can't carry a weapon on the job essentially to be security unless you're qualified to be security, because it's kind of a different thing.
Right.
And I think, somebody who gets their, basically security credentials and then they're carrying as a security guard in addition to being a teacher, I don't think that's a problem to pay those people. I think maybe
it's an extra skill set. It's worth it.
I think you're because they've had to do training. They're acting as a security profession. Now, I think when you talk as a security professional, when you talk as somebody having a CCW, I always kind of think of that as more of like, that's their personal well-being. Like with somebody with a CCW in a classroom, if they're not trained security, I expect them to stay with their class. Someone who's a security agent, somebody's acting in the security capacity, I expect them to go after the target. And I think that's kind of the difference. But here's the thing, I don't think there's necessarily one correct answer, and I think these schools are smart enough to figure out on their own what works best for them. And
that is a lot of faith in some very shitty organizations.
Well, true, but I'd rather have a million shitty organizations all deciding for themselves than one jackass at the top in Washington making policy for everybody. And that's why I support, repealing the gun-free zone stuff, not because I think that every school ever should not be a gun-free zone, because there may be, inner city school, for example. That's probably pretty appropriate time not to make that a gun-free zone. But the trade-off is they have armed security, and they have metal detectors, and they have extremely good access control. But that's them. What I don't want to do is prescribe something all the way across the board in terms of direct security features. I'd rather have a lot of experiments going on at once, and we'll find out what works. Parkland did not work.
Yeah. a lot of this discussion I run into is this elitism in thinking that I have all the facts, I know the right answer, this is how we have to do it. And that's some of the big resistance that I have run into in discussing the topic. It ends up, like you said, going in a circular way.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is engaging my arguments, and I'm not really even arguing. It's just, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it ends up circling back around to whatever circle jerk comment makes somebody feel like they're smarter than me.
Yeah, and I think also what they call it, ascribing intent, because clearly you think the way you do because you hate children and you love the gun lobby.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's that
Definitely nailed it.
Yeah, I mean,
one of the things that has
and then the conversation's over at that point because how if they're ascribing that to your motive, then how can you have a rational conversation with somebody?
It's pretty interesting because I've seen a sort of a flip. I spent a lot of time on Reddit, and Reddit's yeah, Reddit's more. I don't know if I want to say left or, well, they're very anti-gun and they were very pro-Hillary before the election, and I remember a lot of the exchanges that I saw were like, I as a white male could not comment on minority issues or female issues because I simply could not know
your privilege.
What was going on. I could not know their experience. I could not have their knowledge based on both my gender and race, which was kind of bizarre. But all right, fine, whatever. Now when we get talking about firearms, the people from these same groups want to tell me about weapons, and when they don't know that there's a
fully semi-automatic,
they don't know that semi-automatic is not fully automatic. When they think that people are being killed with fully automatic weapons that you can just get falling out of trees, when they don't know that there's a difference between pistol rounds and rifle rounds, when they don't know anything about the background checks, when they don't know anything about concealed carry laws.
That people don't even know the NICS even exists.
And that's the thing. But all of a sudden, it's like, they'll say this stuff to me, and I go, well, you don't know X, Y, Z. I mean, maybe we should have that discussion. It's never, I don't want to shut them down.
People don't want to get up to speed before they give an opinion.
But it's the same people who told me I didn't know shit, so I should sit down and be quiet. I turn around and say, well, you don't, you're missing some knowledge here. Well, you know what I meant. You know what I meant. And,
but Bill, look at Australia and look at England and look at
Australia's got its own problems.
Look at Germany, where there is a gun culture, but you have to jump through all these hoops first. And look at XYZ. And look at how none of these countries have the same cultural and geopolitical dynamics the U.S. has.
And
let's look at that for a second.
Here's before we do that, I want to show the one other thing that sort of makes me chuckle. I have heard over and over again people make jokes about saying like, well, I have a friend who's X, so I could do this. Oh, I'm not racist. Some of my best friends are whatever.
Yeah.
And I'll be reading arguments and discussion boards about the firearm thing, and people will go, well, I'm a gun owner. I'm a Second Amendment supporter, but I don't like all this stuff. And I'm like, what, you got like your Pup-Pup's hunting rifle? It's such a strange way to try to relate to tangentially to a group of people. And
it's the I support the Second Amendment but crowd, which means they fundamentally don't understand what the Second Amendment means.
It's the right to have bear arms, right? Like,
kill a bear and to don its arms as your own.
The furrier, the better.
One, I don't support that because that's hurting bears.
Well,
so
you can get out.
Actively against the Second. Yeah, exactly. Supporting bears.
Get your communist rhetoric out of here.
I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding of the Second Amendment is that it doesn't say guns, it says arms, which meant that and did mean at the time field artillery, cannons, personal war frigates to protect your shipping.
Trebuchet.
Well, part of
trebuchets if you want them.
The counter that
my goodness.
Counter that I get to that a lot.
That?
The counter that I get to that a lot is part of a well-regulated militia, and one thing I hear is the closest thing that we have right now is the National Guard.
But that's also a misinterpretation of what well-regulated means.
In the parlance, it just meant like functional.
It means like a well-regulated engine. That's what that meant. That's how that it's phrased. That's why there's a comma. It's a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. Basically meaning a militia that's trained and ready, so proficient in firearms. And the point being of that, the point of that saying the federal government can't come in and say, well, you can't have you can't be armed and ready because you're a threat to us. That's part one. And then part two saying the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And why? Because the militia can't have arms if the people don't have private ownership of the arms. That's what that means.
Well,
basically.
we don't have militias anymore, do we?
No.
We do, but they're not. But again, we've lived in the lap of security, where I don't feel the need to train with Jake once a month to defend the borders from those evil Canadians.
Although if somebody were to come out and be like, "Bro, do you want to get training once a month and be like a really good owner of a firearm?" I'd be like, "Hell yeah!" See you there, Jake.
Well, it's kind of funny in some ways that is kind of true. They say, "Oh, well, there's no militia," but I got news for you. You could round up a bunch of ex-military and ex-police, and then even some people who are just well acquainted, and probably get a pretty damn good fighting force ready in a very short amount of time.
Well, I mean, it's accurate to say we don't have militias as exampled in the Second Amendment. That's true. It's a non-starter to then take it to let's take the guns.
Correct.
Any
yeah.
guns. It's a non sequitur.
I think it's funny if anything can be reinterpreted, it's the meaning of militia.
Yeah.
Because in terms of the militia has evolved. Because before you used to have to get together and say, okay, well, we have a signal. Now, Hatboro comes under attack. I get on the phone to my four buds with AKs and I call Jake and I say, hey, the aliens are invading. Let's go handle that.
Daniel Craig isn't around. Help.
Yeah, but it's
let's go shoot him with our guns.
The evolution of the need for a meeting constantly militia is not necessarily there. Also, we don't have as many foreign threats. Back in the day, the British came ashore and burned down the White House. Like, you needed that stuff. Now we've been kind of on top for so long. We take for granted the fact that we don't, that your granddad doesn't need to be on call to grab his rifle to go defend your block.
Oh my God, I figured it out. So it's secretly British terrorists sneaking into
They've been
the
trying
US
to take us
government
down
to
the
try
whole
to
time.
take away our arms so we can't defend their final major attack.
That's how they come for the guns, and then all of a sudden, man, British flags fly. That's
Then they're gonna attack Sartee.
We have uncovered the deep dark truth of.
It all started with that damn Harry
I
Potter.
really want them to come over in frigates too. Like,
This is
not
secretly
even
the last act of
Yeah,
the
there's
Queen.
like the sailboats and just like, why is there a fleet of sailboats? Here?
frigates out there
So-
shooting at us.
Was there a
with
South Park
cannons.
episode to that effect?
There was.
There was
like,
a Sniz and Hillary Snook, or Snook and
yeah,
Hillary
I think
Maybe.
so. I think it's that one.
Oh, God.
So you had more papers than the ones that we talked about. Is there? And I don't think we've even really touched on your solution. Do you have any other direction you want to take us?
Basically, my starter is essentially look at the complication that the law enforcement has to deal with. And people want to further say, well, let's have them track down 50 million more rather than a handful of crazy people. That's kind of the starter. That's really, I think that's kind of the meat of the argument is essentially the complication. And my solution is two-part. First part, I say we get rid of the NFA. We get rid of the 86 bans. We get rid of all that stuff because all that does is add more paperwork on the bureaucratic level, and it stops the government from being able to look out for us by tracking down people who are actually threats.
Is this what you were saying before? The 1986 whatever automatic weapons ban. It didn't happen. Was it because there was less? Are you saying that there was less of a drain?
I think in part.
Okay.
And I should say, even if it's not the case, we're now even if that wasn't the case, the reason why these things weren't happening, because I think there's multiple factors. I couldn't begin to start diagnosing every little thing in the culture that's causing, the culture and laws, and that it's such a complicated thing that these disasters are happening. But we're not serving ourselves any good by piling on more piles of paperwork, because regardless of even if the NFA had no effect on these whatsoever, it wasn't worse before and it wasn't better after, or vice versa. We now have added at the point where we've got 300 million people, And we've got in agency bureaus at every county level of ATF offices who are there processing paperwork for the length of rifles and the types of rifles and whether guns can have stocks and whether shot and so on and so on. This 18-page document. They're going through and they're meticulously handling all this stuff and filing it and checking it. When really, wouldn't that agent's time be much better served by, why don't I check up on the kid who, I don't know, said that he was going to shoot up a school?
Right.
It's basically a way to say, they say, oh, we don't have enough personnel to track down, the people, like, oh, we do need to do more. We need to do more. And it's like, I can overnight, by repealing these ridiculous laws, give you thousands and thousands and thousands of federal personnel who are located in every county in the United States of America, every county on the county level. Because I'm an FFL, and the ATF we deal with is in Norristown. They're down the road. They have offices, but basically thousands and thousands of those personnel can be freed up to go deal with actual threats. And overnight,
even just data entry.
Even just
which how much of that basic menial computer stuff could have hedged Parkland.
Exactly. They're not. There's thousands and thousands of people in the mental health system who are supposed to be in the NICS system so that they don't get sold stuff, and it slips by. I mean, for example,
lots of other prior mass shootings were similar in that regard.
Texas. The Air Force, Texas was like that. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
The Air Force just didn't apply the data.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, well, who's going to do that? I got a couple thousand people right here.
Yeah.
I got some people who are measuring the lengths of barrels for people who are never going to commit a crime versus actually doing something like, let's make sure the crazy guy is in the National Instant Check System. And it's literally overnight we could free up. I couldn't even tell you how many thousands, because I don't even know really the size of the amount of complexity that the agency's tied into.
Sorry, it just dawned on me. I don't know very much about the story, but where did the guy get the gun for the Parkland incident? Like, was it his?
He bought it. Yeah, bought it
legally, like through all the.
He passed the
background check.
Okay, all right.
He passed the check,
and he passed the check because the information wasn't passed. Now because he had been institutionalized mentally, he technically lied and committed a felony on his 4473. But the point of that is that if somebody, it's the form you fill out when you're purchasing. But if you can't prove the person's lying. And that's the other thing, is that people get rejected. If you get rejected and it's because you knew because you're a felon and you tried to buy it, and you're like, oh, you know what? I know I have a prior felony, but I'm going to try to buy it and see if I get through. If you do that and get rejected, that's a felony. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an additional felony, basically, and you're supposed to be checked up on. They prosecute, I guess, less than 1%. They even bother following up on people who are doing that.
So, is it if you are institutionalized involuntarily, then?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a domestic violence conviction, if you're a drunkard, there's a ton of things that are supposed to disqualify you on that 4473.
You're dependent on narcotics of any kind.
I should have brought a 4473 with me.
I was one thing that I sort of let my mind wander down is what if you voluntarily submit to some sort of institution? Are you then barred from buying a firearm forever?
I actually am not sure. Because
I could see that really as being a deterrent for
somebody going in and
trying to get proactive help.
Correct. And again, I'm not an expert in the mental health system. No, I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Yes.
I think it's 4473, right?
Yes.
I think because these everything you've been referring to are yes or no questions. Yeah. I think it says involuntary.
Involuntarily committed to.
And I don't think there's any mention of voluntary.
Yeah.
So probably not. But I think it would depend on what happened after that.
Yeah, and that's something that I don't have a mental health care solution. I'm not a psychologist, but I can tell you. I know, but I can tell you as somebody who's an FFL, the layers of paperwork that the ATF are dealing with, and the nonsense hoops they have to jump through, and the fact that they're doing all that stuff, and they still couldn't stop this guy. I can shed some light onto why, and it's because they're spending all their time measuring barrels.
Chris,
the actual wording that's on the form is where'd it go? Have you ever been adjudicated as a mental defective, or have you been committed to a mental institution?
Oh, okay. There you go.
Been committed sounds like
Like someone
somebody
chose
else.
for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Adjudicated definitely sounds like you were told too.
Yeah, that would be judge
Yeah,
court
judge.
order.
Is it
Yeah,
mentally defective? Is that
Mhm.
what?
So the
Okay.
That's a legal term, yeah.
All right.
okay, so and you know what I like about your proposed solution is that it is not very complex.
No.
There's not a whole
No,
lot
no.
of there's not a whole lot of fingers crossed and hope in here. It seems to me to rely on this idea that a lot of the regulation that we have is in practice ineffective.
Well,
Pointless.
these things are happening.
Insofar as like silencer limitations, thanks to what people see, in movies and video games, I believe, they think that silencers sound like when really it's what a 20
It
decibel.
changes it from a jet engine to a jackhammer.
Right.
Yes. Yep.
Because I don't know much about subsonic rounds, which are much quieter, but bullets go faster than the speed of sound. You're still dealing with
You get a supersonic crack, and most most bullets are moving supersonic, and
so there's even if you have something to suppress the other noise, your bullet's still going to make a supersonic crack. But okay, so
there's an explosion happening in the chamber,
right.
So there's like a lot of things going on.
So if it's explained how that's ineffective, we say, all right, well maybe we're supposed to have suppressors.
And funny enough, the legal term, to kind of stick on that again, is silencer.
Yeah,
Even though they
It's
do no
not
such
silent.
thing.
Yeah.
But they,
have never
and
done
that's the
such
thing is they decide what a silencer
Quieter.
is, because people have in the past they design a gun and they're like, hey, if I baffle the barrel a little bit and I gotta put a really good end block on it or something like and they want to make it quieter, and then the ATF says now it's a silencer. It might not make it really that much silent, but now it's a silencer. And it's like why are
Say
they wasting their
suppressor.
time with this?
And I think that everybody knows that anything the government does involves a lot of paperwork. So that part of the argument, because X, there's more paperwork, right?
Yeah.
And there's this regulation, and it's sort of it's ineffective. Like barrel length is almost completely pointless. More paperwork,
Yep.
and the government. I mean, as big and as bad as the federal government, and I mean bad like as in like badass, whatever. As big as bad as the federal government and its funding may seem, they do have a finite amount of manpower and money that they can dedicate to any specific task.
Correct.
So we do have, and you'll see it time and time again with different people committing crimes. They also had you have people on probation who have firearms on them, and then they commit another crime. And I'm like, we could have got him for that. We could have got him right there for even having a firearm.
Well, the majority of the gun crimes committed, especially stuff that's lethal, it's usually people who are repeat offenders.
And so if we have more people, the idea being that we can enforce these potentially effective existing laws that we already have, we'll just have money and people to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the list of laws that we don't enforce that already are, that's why I don't understand why people want to.
Can you go through some of them?
I'm trying to think, like.
Well, like the felony you just mentioned, if you try to apply
Yeah, if you apply and if you try to buy a gun and it's illegal for you to buy a gun and you get rejected, they're supposed to follow up. And I think there's probably been like
fraction.
Now, are you
14
saying-
people prosecuted
You
in
said
the
it was-
last
yeah,
20
like-
years or something. Like, it's ridiculous.
You said 1%. Is that an accurate number, or are you just like
No, I think it's around that.
1% of people who have a felony and try to apply,
Yeah,
or
but
1% of every gun buyer?
No. I
Is
mean,
it okay?
of the people who
Okay.
committed this crime by trying to purchase.
Okay.
When they're not
Again,
That they
and
actually
getting
get the
rejected.
follow up and prosecuted.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's. I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but it is around that. It's not. I'm not exaggerating.
The other thing to consider too is I'm kind of going to zoom out a bit with all these sorts of. It even goes back to one of our earliest discussions on the main show of who's a gamer. Well, anyone can say they are. Who's a gun owner? Anyone who owns a gun. Who's a Republican? Anyone who puts the R next to their ballot. These are all elective demographics. Okay? And as soon as you do that, any examination of even a decent cross section of them, a decent percentage of them, based on some box ticked behavior, cannot speak to the whole, because anyone can just say they are. Anyone who worked a desk job in the Army can now say, I'm a veteran and I want to repeal the Second Amendment. They can do that, and they'll and the people who want to hear that sort of thing will lap it up.
They eat it up,
and vice versa too. I'm a veteran, and I think we should repeal the NFA. Is a corollary to that, and it's a similar story. And kind of, did I just forget the point I wanted to make off of that? But basically, like, oh right, so then you look at the I support the Second Amendment, but crowd, like we mentioned earlier, the cats who will get onto message boards and Facebook comment threads and what have you, or even in open discussion and say, we don't want to take your guns. Not even some of them. We don't want to take them. We want, XYZ regulation. It's like, okay, well, tell me who we is. You? Everyone who thinks like you.
It's the children, Jake.
What's the label that I'm supposed to ascribe to this version of we you have used? Because legislation was introduced in Pennsylvania to ban the AR-15. Whether it probably won't go anywhere, but that is exactly the opposite of what you just told me, sir or ma'am. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So you can't speak with that kind of authority when you say we don't want to do XYZ because someone in your camp does.
We know, and I hear that a lot. Nobody wants to take your guns. Yes, some people do, and I think it was in Honolulu. Was it the police chief sent out a notice that if you had a marijuana usage license, they wanted you to turn over your guns, and then they wanted you to turn in your guns because you're technically in commission of a federal crime. So they wanted you to turn your guns in, and there was a lot of resistance. And then they said, "Okay, we don't need them. We're not gonna take them from you, but we will not issue any new licenses for ownership to people who have marijuana prescriptions."
Oh boy!
Right.
As long as we remain Schedule 1, I mean that's going to be.
After in the wake of a number of different national disasters, we've seen the National Guard empowered to confiscate people's weapons, and I recall reading about specifically after Hurricane Katrina, there were forced evacuations of different areas. People wanted to stay. The government came in and said, "You don't get to stay here anymore. You have to leave." However, as you were forced to leave, you were not allowed to take your firearms. So who took them?
Feds came in and took them.
And that's it. So this idea that nobody wants to take your guns is patently untrue. It is not true. People do. Mm-hmm. And this is the thing that can be so frustrating about talking to such a diverse group. You know what I mean? Especially with, people who might share some of my arguments, but are not a good example of, are not exactly what I want my opposition to see. People who are, I was at a party the other day. A guy who's a veteran, he had his pistol there, and he was talking about it, and he pulled it out at the party. Right now, I have a rule: if a firearm appears at a social event like that, I leave that event. Now, people go, "It is nightmarish that you even have to have that rule," but I do. And I said to him, "Okay, I'm leaving the party right now." And he goes, "Why?" I said, "Because you pulled your pistol out." And he's like, "Oh, dude, I'm a veteran." I'm like, "And you should know better, because you just lasered me with your fucking pistol." He's like, "Well, I'm like, that's not really the point. The point is like,
maybe somebody shouldn't be muzzling everybody, and let's walk out."
Right. So I'm like, and lasering is when you have the gun, you actually it drags across a person the way it's pointed. So
muzzling, lasering. I think there's a couple terms.
Yeah. There are several. There are some fundamental rules to firearm safety that anyone handling a firearm does know at some point, even if they lapse on them from time to time.
Yeah.
One of them is you always assume it's loaded. Always. And therefore, anything the muzzle points at, prepare to have it be destroyed. Therefore, never point it at people. Ever. So to hear about a veteran at a probably reasonably packed party,
and 12 people.
There were people there.
Yeah.
Okay. It wasn't just like a couple jabronis in the gun shop or up here where we're tinkering and we're all very careful to abide those rules. You want to do that, fine, but you're going off from the corner. You're drawing into the corner, you're clearing that weapon, and it's staying pointed in a safe direction at all times. Staying on the edges of the walls, facing the wall or something. Pointing straight down at the ground, whatever. You got to do that shit religiously. You have to, because it only takes one fuck up.
My roommate made an error clearing a weapon. He had a pistol, which I didn't know about. Not that it mattered, it's his business, but whatever. It would have been kind of nice to know. I hear, I'm like, what the fuck was that? And I thought something fell over because it was a 22, which is a small caliber. He's like, yo, did you hear that gun go off? And I was like, my gun went off? I'm like, I don't keep that thing loaded. What? So I run into my room and I check it. And he's like, no, it was mine. He's like, I thought it was empty. I was clearing it. And he must have dropped the mag and had one in the chamber and pulled the trigger. Yeah. But guess what? His gun was pointed to an exterior wall, which is brick covered in plaster, and the bullet went in there and nothing bad happened. Yep. He fucked up one of the rules, assuming that it wasn't loaded, but he followed another rule and it kept us safe.
Yeah, there's a redundancy to the rules of safety, basically. Which I can kind of appreciate that, especially with the 22. You might clear that. It might not eject.
Right.
And I could just see somebody getting complacent and then...
My dad is a...
Our big fan. Biggest fan.
He has some gun safety techniques that I have learned from him. And one of them I really like is when you open a pistol, you lock it back, you lock the slide back so it stays in open position, and you can access where the bullet is seated in a compartment called the chamber. He not only looks, he checks it with his hand, checks the chamber, see if there's one in there, breaks contact with it, and then checks again. And it's something that I've adopted, and I actually really enjoy it quite a bit. So there are techniques that...
I usually do the touch, but I've never seen it. I guess twice, yeah. Can't hurt.
Yeah. Just so, if you're doing it out of habit, break, and you're like, oh, wait a minute,
It's one of those things that the more thorough you are, the safer you be.
There's another thing that
takes half a second, and it could stop you from putting a hole in something you don't want a hole in.
Right. So while I'm rolling down this conversation, that's one of the things that I bring up. People don't want to take our guns. Yes, they certainly do. Some of them. The other thing is, somebody's like, oh, there's nobody uses guns to resist an oppressive government. That's preposterous.
They have drones and tanks and shit.
Well, I'm not okay. We won't even get into how if the big bad federal government opposed the people, the law enforcement would split and this, that, and the other thing.
AWOLs.
Also, small arms are the backbone of resistance.
So the first thing is that I really do believe an armed populace serves as a deterrent, which means that nothing happens for longer than nothing would happen if the populace wasn't armed.
Correct.
It's hard to prove that that's why it's happening, but fundamentally I think that makes sense because it could be pretty costly to become too oppressive. But there have been in the I think it was 1947 is an example. There was I think it was a town, might have been a county, a corrupt sheriff. He did something like...
Yeah, of course now the name escapes me, yeah.
Right. He did something like murder a black fella for racial reasons. And the community went, nope, not anymore, buddy. And they revolted against the sheriff and his deputies, engaged in actual firefights, drove them from the town, and the only person who was charged with a crime in that instance was the sheriff for murder.
Mm-hmm.
There are, those militiamen out in Oregon who haven't been convicted when they occupied the federal land.
Oh, yeah.
They got off, actually.
Yeah, they did, because there were more agents than you would think in their little community. The laws that they went after were like crazy. They're like life sentences. They went after all these life sentences.
That prosecution overshot big time.
Why did the government not simply go in and arrest everybody? Because they were armed.
Because they were armed.
Right?
Yeah.
The only person who I think the only person who was shot at was the guy who got out of the SUV after the altercation. Now, interesting point about this. It was a group of individuals driving in a van, and I think the police set up a blockade.
Yeah, they tried to go around a blockade and they got stuck, I think. Something like that.
Well, here's the thing about that. One guy got out. He reached for his weapon. He was then killed by federal. He might have been killed by a state level. He was killed by some officer.
Yeah.
Turns out that as that car was approaching the roadblock, it was fired upon.
Oh, really?
Yes, in fact, it was fired upon. And the remarkable thing was that was not reported by the federal agency who was responsible for shooting at and reporting it.
No wonder they got off.
It was simply not reported. So the narrative was the guy got out, reached for his gun to fight the police to stop from being arrested or whatever. It changes a little bit when his vehicle's already being fired upon, and then he got out and reached for his weapon. You know, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's. I'm not even saying that the feds were necessarily in the wrong for engaging a vehicle rushing a roadblock.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I think the whole they want to make everything clean and clear, and it's like if you're not telling the truth, then
just I think a big problem with us getting anywhere in our current environment is that we keep having the same conversations over and over again. And the powers that be, the people that we put ahead of us, they sort of benefit about knowing how things are going to go, right? They can say, all right, we want to have control of this, and we want to get this person elected, and blah, 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 blah. And when things don't change, they know how the game is played. But there are constructive conversations that we can be having, right? And there are applications where people successfully use firearms to deter action against them and defend themselves. And there are people who want to take away all our guns and things like that. And this new solution that you've presented to us breaks the mold, right? It's not give everybody X. It's not arm everybody. It's not arm nobody. It's somewhere right in the middle.
I think it's a very practical thing that is based on the reality of what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Because I give you thousands of federal agents ready to track down crazy people, and in exchange, you stop bothering us.
Right.
I think it's a win-win.
The I think it's pretty brilliant, but I have my solution is 3-layered, right? I'm interested to see what you think of it.
Okay, sure.
Immediately harden the schools. If the campus is not surrounded by a fence of some sort, or at least the students, put a fence around so people cannot gain access to an area with children without crossing some sort of checkpoint.
Now by this plan, do you mean like having security officers or?
That is also part of it. Put a fence up,
Okay.
Have security officers, have some level of screening, identification. I mean, we have more security on college dorms with swipe badges than we do with
Are you ever just trying to get to a random building in New York City? Like
and you can have a property fenced in, and you can have security guards without it feeling like a prison or even a courthouse. But I think that would immediately stop a lot of the problems that we're seeing with schools. Like I said, I acknowledge that it would push people to other soft targets, but medium term, create a central intelligence database to report relevant crimes, and I'm not sure exactly what to deem as relevant. I don't know, high-level drug crimes where you're, I don't know, pounds of whatever, or felonies or misdemeanors or violent ones or whatever. Somebody else better than me can deem that. But create a intelligence sharing platform that law enforcement is legally obligated to report to, even suspicious stuff. Now, I know that sounds a little dangerous because false accusations, but part of my plan would be to build in an inexpensive and reasonable way for citizens to challenge assertions stored in that information. That would be my medium-term thing. And then long-term, I have settled on this opinion that if you are pro-2A, pro-Second Amendment, you almost have to be pro-healthcare access, because 60% of gun violence, I believe, is suicide. A huge portion of it is gang related. And you say, Well, if we want to stop shootings, let's stop people from shooting other people right there. Let's get them before they do. Let's arrest them or whatever. But I think the real answer to these questions is how do we make people stop wanting to commit these acts, right? We couldn't stop people from drinking because we couldn't stop people from wanting to drink. If we stop people from wanting to kill themselves and wanting to harm others, and I think a big part of that is a support network so that people who are having mental issues can seek help, and general support, and so people don't feel isolated from society and feel like they have a vested interest. Now, this got way more into my own political views than I really meant to, but that's my three-stage thing. Harden schools, data sharing that you're obligated to report to, and support health access.
First thing about hardened schools, I'd say you're correct. I would caution you from prescribing specific solutions per building, per school.
Sure.
I think they should get rid of the gun-free zones, and there should be federal, let's look into this, but there shouldn't be, we're going to tell you what to do, because I think every school can figure out what's best for them.
Okay.
So I would caution it against like, oh, well, we're just going to have a security force that protects this. It's like, that might not be the best solution for everybody. But I don't think, I should say, I don't think that line of thinking is dangerous. I think it's kind of where we need to go.
Okay. Fair point.
Second part. As for mandatory reporting, that's the thing. We have mandatory reporting. The FBI is supposed to track this stuff. That's part of the National Instant Check system. It's supposed to be that database to make sure we figure out what's going on. And they ain't doing their job.
Well, how do we make it so that they have to?
You start prosecuting people for dropping the ball. You start finding them, firing them. There's no accountability.
Why not? That's what I don't get. Was it not given teeth, or is somebody just choosing not to?
Well, I don't know. The deputy director of the FBI was just fired. I mean, there's so much corruption systemically all the way through the system, and nobody wants to be held accountable, and they just pass the buck. The fact that nobody's been fired for the agent who got the information from about the Parkland shooter from the people who called it in and did not pass that on to the Miami field office. What do you think's happened to that agent?
Promotion.
We have no idea. They just said, oh, yeah, something we got to work on. Was this person held individually accountable? No. I mean, if this had been somebody like, on an oil rig who, like, somebody said, hey, there's going to be a problem, and then the guy just was like, ignored it, and then the rig explodes and killed 17 people. That guy's going to prison probably for the rest of his life. But I'm not saying that necessarily that should be the case for this person, but we don't know. We don't know what the reforms have been. They just say, oh, well, there's going to be discipline. We have no idea. Really, it should be that person should be fired. At the very least. And their supervisors should be fired, and we should find out why they decided that they weren't going to pass this information on. Now, if the fact is that they're overworked, well, my solution provides quite a few other agents who could be working on that.
Right.
So, but we'll cross that bridge. But we actually don't know at this point. So either they don't have the personnel, which I find laughable, or at the very least, the reason why they're not doing it is because they're measuring barrel lengths and doing all kinds of stupid stuff, or there's not accountability. And I tend to think there's just not accountability because Orlando happened and the FBI didn't pass on the information or stop that guy either.
What information did they pass on about the Orlando?
Disney called and said, hey, this guy's casing the place. And then the first FFL he tried to purchase his rifle from, they called the FBI, and then they were like, hey, this guy was super suspicious. And, it doesn't take too much to triangulate points of data for, this guy.
He also had a domestic history.
Correct. A domestic violence history,
yep.
Which means that should have been picked up as well. And all it would have taken literally was just somebody on the phone saying, okay, let me look this guy up.
This was the Pulse shooting.
This is the Pulse shooting.
Yeah.
And it just would have taken
the
laws. That's what I'm saying. The laws in place, had they been enforced, and which by enforced just means somebody just needed to do their job, and they just didn't do it.
Somebody needed to try more than not at all.
Right. Correct. And that's the disturbing part is that, government's not going to protect you. We want to say, oh, we'll get the people in to do it. And it's like, wow, somebody might be gung-ho, but really at the end of the day, the only person protecting you is you.
Right. And then the third stage was better access to mental health care. And I want to bring up a separate point
Okay.
as we roll along to that. I have been reading comments from people that they're like, what did they say? 90% of people who survive attempted suicide later regret it. And they say, therefore, everybody who died from a firearm, 90% of them would have regretted it had they survived, but they didn't survive because they used a firearm, because we can access firearms. And there are a few things about that kind of drive me bananas. The only conclusion that you can draw from 90% of people who survived, well, I think the one that you can be sure about, 90% of people who survived regret it, is that the next person who survives, 90% chance that they will have regretted it. The people who succeed, I don't think that you can surmise their feelings about it. Second off, I think it is incredibly demeaning to the individual struggles of people dealing with suicide to say that, well, the only reason that they killed themselves is because they had a gun, right? If they didn't have a gun, they'd be here. They'd be fine.
It simplifies, and again, it's the let's blame an object instead of the person, essentially. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way to blame somebody for committing suicide, but it's like they are really the focus. Their health, their mental health, their well-being is really the focus of what we need to work on.
Sorry. I flipped my phone a little bit. Kind of like a counterpoint to that, though. Like, couldn't you argue, like, bring up Japan and how few people have firearms, but the suicide rates are sky high?
Yeah.
Because it's not about guns at that point. They
guns.
find a way besides guns to do it. Like, if you want to do it, you're going to find a way.
Also, does that account for the discrepancy between male and female suicide?
Oh,
That's
well,
right,
the
'cause
point, one of the points I was...
Women's usually don't.
One of the points that I was reading was that guys have more guns than women, so it backs up this assertion that guns are...
Well, women, at
Except-
least in the U.S., last I saw, women try to kill themselves more, but men are just better at it.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So...
Look, I'll prove you wrong.
Give me your gun!
Whoa.
Give me your gun! I'm going to prove it right now!
Birthday, death day.
Well, birthday, death day.
Suicide. Hilarious. No, I mean...
Only when it's done by women.
Well, I think, again, we're
shit.
and I think
Jesus.
He's the only one on the podcast who could make that joke. God damn.
Nailed it.
Oh, my God.
Well, one of the healthier ways to deal with hard subjects and sad subjects is to laugh at them, apparently. I don't know. That's all I had.
You also have to look at, too, like, since you're bringing up Japan, they have I don't know if you guys know about it. They actually have a place called the Suicide Forest, where people go there and they hang themselves, they seppuku, the whole, because they see suicide is a little bit more symbolic to them, but they're also under significantly more stress than we are.
Well, if
like
you
they intentionally stress themselves out with like work. They work very long hours.
Well,
they're constantly out of commute. So you have to look at it like from a cultural standpoint. Also,
I don't want to judge them in that sense. I don't know, because I don't know 100% what. I don't know what triggers suicide deep inside somebody, outside of basically, it's very hard to speculate outside of personal experience where you can say what brings somebody to that point. And I think in some cases it's a cry for help. In some cases it's a type of communication. It's been with us since the dawn of time. We don't, people kill themselves and it's terrible, but I don't know. I think it's hard to, especially if you're like, well, if you don't have them, well, then they'll start drinking bleach or something, and then they'll ban those. It's like why are the kids eating Tide Pods?
It's
not because Tide Pods exist. It's because
it's cool.
There's another problem here.
Well, it's because there was a meme, and memes are funny, and people take them seriously because they're stupid.
We had I had
Just look tasty.
I had a friend who committed suicide. He made up his mind to do it. He put his affairs in order, even gave keys to people who would need his keys. He went on a long motorcycle ride because that's what he liked to do. Then he went to a specific location, took out his service pistol, and shot himself in the heart, ostensibly so that they could look at his face after he was gone. And he went to a certain location knowing that people that he knew would be able to find him. Does that sound like a rash decision to you?
No, it's not impulsive. It was planned out.
No, and that's what I mean. It's impossible to prescribe one size fits all for even something, especially something like even mental health. What's driving the rash? I don't know.
And that's where we get to my third point, which I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Universal access to mental health care. And I know that like universal health care gets people riled up for a number of different really good reasons. But to me, personally, my ability to protect myself at different levels through Second Amendment is more important than my worry about governmental healthcare bureaucracy. And I'm sort of curious what the other people in the room think about that.
I think that may be opening a whole other, because you're kind of entering basically does the government have the responsibility of providing healthcare if they're also providing, or I should say it's fundamentally different in terms of the way I look at it, where the Second Amendment is rights, and they're inalienable rights, and you can say that's from God or that's just from the right of existing, and that's completely different than the government must provide this service because they also provide this freedom, or because this freedom exists. And I'm not. That's kind of where I think that's a little hairy. Do I think the lowest of the low should be taken care of in the sense of like somebody who's completely on their own and doesn't have necessarily the money to access any sort of healthcare, let alone mental health care. Do I think we kind of as a society should maybe look out for that person? I do. I'm not a fan of creating a massive bureaucracy, and also I don't really tie that to the fundamental right to be armed, no more than I would tie it to the right to free speech. Well, people can say really mean things and bully people and say horrible stuff. So don't we, if we want to have that right, then don't we need to make sure that people feel better? Yeah. And that's kind of how I approach that. I don't have a personal prescription for the way mental health needs to be reformed necessarily. I know the data is not getting from point A to point B. I know laws aren't being enforced, but in terms of like what's the psychological diagnosis, you'd have to, what's the best solution? You'd have to ask somebody who's probably a medical professional about what they can do.
Yeah, that was
because I don't have a strong solution for that, because
that point
it's not
three
something
to
I
me
know
was
about.
sort of like, I didn't mean to prescribe what the government is obligated to do because of our secured rights. It was more that, like, I think tactically, if I want less of a threat from people who, they eventually could vote to put people in the government who could change the Constitution, then I could lose my Second Amendment right. It could happen. If I wanted to take away, pardon the pun, I suppose, their ammunition to use against me in my argument, that cutting down those numbers on like suicide and other violence might be done through available healthcare. That was sort of a tactical thing, but the reason that it jives in my head is because I see the role of the government more to allow citizens the means to exercise their rights, to provide for that, as opposed to limiting to demand good behavior. So promote good action as opposed to demand that there isn't certain negative action. What I mean, like, you just say, Bill, you're king of America. What would you do? What are some of the things you would do? Well, we don't even have a right to drive, right? But we do have driver education courses in schools to make people better and more responsible. One of our constitutional rights is the access to firearms, but we don't have gun safety courses available in all schools.
And we used to.
We used to, and note how these things didn't happen back then.
When did that stop?
Probably around the time our parents were in school. I mean, rifle clubs kind of slowly got phased out, and it just gun culture fluctuates.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where it was at such a low where, and then, what do you mean introduce guns into the school? And it's like, well, okay, you put it that way, it sounds nasty, but really, that use firearms just part of life for most people, usually back in the day. But now it's part of life for a lot of people, but not everybody. And there's this huge divide.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could say the same thing about a lot of practical skills, like
welding, wood shop, you name it.
Yeah, that, or like home ec, or
Home ec,
like
yeah.
knowing basic financial.
I never learned how to
practices.
balance a checkbook. I mean, who does anymore? I used to
Right.
do everything online, but
Right, but still, like I remember that was an option for me in high school, and I took it, and like I know some stuff now. I'm not an expert. I'm not gonna I don't know that much about the stock market. I
didn't
do
know
investing kind
I
of
didn't know
stuff.
crap about doing my taxes until I started working in the finance industry,
Right.
where
But
I
you
have to tell people, what they need to know as far as their investments are concerned.
I still don't know crap about taxes.
It's horrible.
I do them, and my head just spins, which
It's
is
goofy.
But taxes are still a problem. Like people will still either if they don't know or they just choose to skip doing them, or
It's
It's still
that's a
something-
whole other.
it's something you need to do, kind of, or you need to know at least about. And I don't know if
I think we're kind of getting into some of the problems with the education system as it is, and I think there's a
I think
whole
what we're
other-
really having speaking to the whole time are the issues with the government. Period. The very reliance on such a large bureaucratic behemoth to consolidate responsibilities and to legislate and to oversee things. And it's easy to look at that and take the full-blown libertarian approach and say, well, this is horse shit. Let's let everyone do their own thing. But then you have there's a trade-off to that as well, in that, okay, if there isn't, say, a judicial system to mediate both civil and criminal disputes, or a criminal system for that matter to determine what is a crime. Now, if there was no law against murder, would murder go up? Probably. But would most people still be abhorred by it? Probably.
Yeah.
It's like a natural human impulse. We would not have survived as a species if it were okay to kill each other.
Well, you're getting. I mean, that's natural law. I mean, you go back to the Ten Commandments. Even it's pretty straightforward. Thou shalt not murder, because you can't build a civilization if you don't have certain boundaries in place.
How many of the 10 Commandments are law? I've topped out at 3. But
yeah,
that's a whole.
No, but you still can't. It's kind of the fundamentals of civilization building. We respect these. And the other thing is you don't murder. And functionally, you don't murder, because then somebody's just going to do it to you.
Exactly. But without that kind of mediation and adjudication, if we, the Two Guns No Ammunition gang, decide to go beat up another podcast,
podcast wars,
podcast war, if we go beat up the drunken peasants or Joe Rogan, just go fight Joe Rogan. I don't care how good he is at MMA. There's a million of us.
You can't fight all of us at the same time.
I mean, if we were to do that shit and succeed, our victims' only recourse would be to come back and do the same thing to us, back and forth. And that's something we saw even in the early stages of our country, where these laws were in place, with moonshiners and whatnot, where because it was a black market, they're still resolving, and this still happens now with the drug war. Disputes are resolved with violence because there is no adjudication there. There's no mediation. There's no system in place where everyone shows up, probably looks presentable for the judge and the jury.
Your life and your property are yours, and the state recognizes that. And we, as functioning with the state, say that, yes, we enforce the fact, when you leave your house, somebody can't just go in and take your stuff because you're not there.
Right.
And we agree to that. And that's kind of what the foundation of really English law is, basically, is that. And
I think it stems sort of. I think there's always been some sort of natural impulse to it, just like with murder.
It's natural law.
But I think the legal part of it definitely comes out of the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment.
Yeah.
The recognizing of the individual and what have you, and something that kind of, to circle back, that libertarians very much lean upon, and I have some sympathies with it. But at the same time, without that mediating force, without some consolidation of power to some degree, to be that muscle for the grandmother whose house is broken into while she's asleep at night, that woman can't
trade enforcement.
that woman can't raise, a militia to go track down, Coca-Cola. if they
Wait, what?
or Comcast, or if some big company, if some private enterprise has grown to such strength and decides to flex its muscle in a way that we currently recognize as criminal, but there's no crime because there's no one to mitigate that dispute or to prevent it or to dole out punishment as appropriate. It doesn't have to be an elderly grandmother. If it's just fucking me, right? If it's just me in my house and some goons from some big company, doesn't matter, real or fictitious, violates me in some way, if my only recourse is to storm their gates with a firearm and maybe get a few of my friends together, that's not equitable. Okay, even if I succeed, even if I John Wick my way through the entire establishment and avenge my dead puppy, that's not realistic for most people, and it shouldn't have to be relied upon.
Can't function like that,
right? And that's why the most extreme, say, libertarian angle on these sorts of issues.
You're talking like anarcho-capitalist kind of.
Yeah, because I have some friends who've gone down that road and who are still there, and I'm like, you're silly. You're just silly.
I admire the "please leave me the hell alone."
Yeah,
I admire that a lot.
I'm right there with it.
I feel most of the time, but I think the concept there's no role for a government is also, I think that's also fundamentally opposed to really what our founders even intended. They never said, oh, well, there's limited government, but they didn't also say, oh no, none at all, ever.
Yeah. Literal Wild West forever and ever, amen.
Amen.
Yeah, that's and of course I think that what kind of got my head down this tangent was the talk of bureaucracy with healthcare, and how muddy do you want this water to be with the while trying to shoot for getting this equal access for everyone. I'm very much a proponent, and we don't have to. I don't think we should even go down the whole healthcare road. Mm-hmm. But I'll just say for the record that I'm very much a proponent of some form of effective universal healthcare. And I'm willing to hash that out. It's by far one of my most left positions, I guess, because I don't need it to be guaranteed in the Constitution for me personally, morally, to consider it a right in the wealthiest nation on earth. And I think these are on prior episodes of the main show, the one where we talked about swatting in particular. I just snapped right in your microphone with my fingers. I'm sorry. It's losing my train of thought. God damn it.
It doesn't need to be recognized in the Constitution to be a right.
You were talking about swatting.
Yeah. Well, but basically, I think finding truly effective solutions to any of these things is going to solve so many other problems along the way to getting there. And I think there is some kind of, not necessarily a single silver bullet, but a mag full of them.
No.
but a mag full of them.
Every little,
with a bullet for each individual problem. That if accurately fired,
after practicing all gun safety practice in a responsible way,
just shoot your way. Just John Wick everything. That's the
moral of the story.
What would John
here.
Wick do? And that's
vengeance.
That's
vengeance and guns. Go.
Vengeance and guns.
John Wick.
Is that John Wick?
Inception.
Sounds like Hans Zimmer.
I'm not going to put on the...
Actually, I don't remember. Did John Wick even have a soundtrack?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
YouTube it.
He's just
awesome.
silent the whole movie.
It's awesome.
I just remember a lot of pain and being like, hey, that's Keanu Reeves. I haven't seen him in like 10 years.
I love those movies so much.
I just imagine you saying that through the whole movie. Just, hey, it's Keanu Reeves.
There he is again. Where did he come from?
Oh my God, he's back.
Wait, he's in this movie?
That's the soundtrack.
Oh my God.
While John Wick is doing
What's Keanu Reeves doing here?
There's Keanu Reeves.
And then I saw Keanu Reeves again. He shot 4 more guys in the face.
So, your solution.
Yeah, I like. Let's just say, not to toot my own horn. I like my solution because
It's
it
the
doesn't
final
claim to
one?
fix everything, and also, yeah, it's correct. No. It doesn't claim to fix every problem that we're having, but it is at least something that we can get off, legal gun owners' backs and actually focus on actual people who are problems.
It does take some level of trust. You know what I mean? Like it.
So does getting behind the wheel of a car.
Right. I'm not picking at it. I'm not nitpicking. Don't get me wrong. But if you're selling this to somebody who's totally opposed, I'm imagining going around and telling my friends about this. They have to trust that, the manpower and money will be freed up, and that these regulations won't blow up in a really much more horrible way. But it doesn't seem like there's a reason that they would.
Well, I can't guarantee the federal government's going to do its job, because we could give it millions of dollars and millions of personnel, and we see it doesn't do its job all the time. And it's frustrating. So I can't speak for the ATF to say they'll actually, if I free up their agents, they'll actually start doing some good law enforcement. I can't guarantee that. Of course not.
Right.
But what I can guarantee is that at least there's not the excuse of, we've got all this paperwork to deal with. And also, and again, the solution is to say, well, why not just ban everything? And I say, okay, you want to get rid of AR-15s, you're talking 30 million, you have to go track them down. Is that really worth our time to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be the strongest point of the argument, is basically when you say, okay, let's do what you want to do, but I'm going to tell you that is that really worth your time? Wouldn't you rather these people be following up on,
legitimate concerns.
threats?
Chris, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I think a lot of it too. I think as firearms owners, we should probably start policing ourselves too. And even right to like the gun shops. I think in some respects that, it's like you said, it's like someone in the government, like you're like, do you really trust them to do their job, to do this properly? You could say the same could be said, at gun stores. Like, is that associate going to be more concerned with getting the sale rather than selling a weapon to somebody who should not be in possession of a weapon? Because if their record is clear, they're going to clear the background check and they're going to get the weapon. But that's a computer. But like a person face to face, you can make a different kind of judgment.
So you're
Correct.
saying
And for any reason, as an FFL, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, for any reason you can say as a FFL or an associate that you're not selling the weapon to them.
I've seen it.
And you don't have to tell,
You have to explain why.
You don't have to tell them why. It can be any reason, and they cannot sue you.
So
there is a lot of self-policing that goes on. You'd be surprised by people who come in and they look like, I'm looking to buy the cheapest gun and one bullet. Let's see. And they don't, and they get these people help, or at the very least, they don't sell them the weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of self-policing that goes on. But I mean, they're also, if you run the background check, then.
Well, what do I do as a citizen who has a concern about another citizen? This is something I've thought about to myself. Like, if you're like, this guy seems a little off,
Call the Dontron hotline.
right.
Well, I mean,
Get him deported.
What am I going to do? Call the FBI and get his house raided over something that I'm not even sure about?
Look at it right here in our backyard. There was that guy. Probably
don't look in
about
our backyard.
Yeah,
Look in somebody else's
not
backyard.
lit. Yeah, but there was right here in Chester County. There was that one guy who shot his neighbor because they were on two political spectrums, and he shot him right in his front yard in front of his kids.
Oh.
But it was known that this guy was a fucking wacko.
But what happens in the see something, say something sort of, it sounds practical to me, but what do you do? What does a citizen do that's, how do you act responsibly while keeping aware, right? So I'll give a specific example. I had walking through my neighborhood the other day, what looked to be a 10-year-old kid with an airsoft rifle that
We think.
looked, I suppose it was an airsoft rifle. It looked pretty darn realistic. but there was no visible orange tip from where I could see him. Granted, he was across the way, but that orange is pretty visible. He's walking through a playground, and there's parents and families, and they don't really seem to notice him. And I'm like, ugh. Like, either this is a 10-year-old kid with an airsoft gun, or it's somebody super deranged, very casually walking over to commit some horrible crime, because he was very casually
very short
walking.
person too.
A very
Right.
short, young-looking person.
But I started to think to myself, what action could I take? Do I accost the individual? No. Because there's two things that could happen. One, I didn't need to, or two, I did need to, and I've made a bad decision. Or two, do you call it in your local police? But that's hard to do when I've seen videos of police responding, getting out of their car and just shooting people. They just get out and shoot people. So, what the hell do I do to self-police my community, whichever community that is, and not accidentally get people killed? That's a legitimate question I have in my head, as ridiculous as it may sound.
I think the fear of the cop just showing up, getting out, shooting somebody, that has happened. And it does happen occasionally. It's horrible. That really is an issue with police training and communication. I don't think that's typically a concern. Now, not that that's not legitimate, but that's kind of its own, that shouldn't be occurring regardless. So,
but that's one of those things. It's like, it does. There's a lot of things that shouldn't
well, it
happen.
does, but also, are you going to be the one to go up and confront the 10-year-old? I mean, somebody's got to do it, right? I mean, where's this kid's parents, right? Kids walk around with a rifle, no parents. 10. I mean, but that's the thing, is like, how active do you want to be in your community?
Well, I know what I don't want is to be the guy who called the police on a harmless 10-year-old and then he died.
Okay.
And I know it's very unlikely, but I've been the recipient of some pretty unlikely events. You know what I mean?
No, I can appreciate that. I don't know if there's a solution to that. I mean,
Right.
I think that's kind of just life.
I mean, I've been, I wasn't 10, but I've been that 10-year-old. There was an occasion where, obviously much older. I was like 19 or 20, and I was meeting up with some friends to go airsofting in some nearby woods. And I showed up in like full kit, like full camo, vest, holster. And I had a trunk full of airsoft guns. It was a dicey looking situation. I was picking up some friends at their house. It was a pretty open little suburb. There was no fence or nothing. And they were, toying with it in their toying with some of my toys in their backyard. Right. And cop was called because we were kind of lingering. Dude shows up, pulls over, gets out and talks to me. I'm like, hey, what's going on? He's like, oh yeah, this is what we're gonna. I just told him straight up, this is what we're doing. These are all. You can look at them. They're all just toys. There's just BBs. There's no bullets, right? And he like was like, oh okay, it just kind of spooks people around here, but clearly everything's all right. Just make sure you're safe, and here are some of the rules. Then just so you guys don't get in trouble, and pack up, be on your way if that's all right. He was like very nice about it, and I'm like, a big dude in camo with a bunch of very realistic looking firearms, right? And I very well could have been the one. He could have, if he came out of that car, gun drawn on me, I would have understood, and I might well have gotten shot no matter what I did. But that didn't happen. So these are two anecdotes.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that same story where the cop rolls up, has everybody at gunpoint for their actual paintball guns with hoppers and shit on them.
Yeah, well, nobody is more bored than suburban cops.
Well, and here's the thing, that argument, I'm not ascribing the argument to you, but that argument, well, it's very unlikely. Well, yeah, but part of the reason that I'm a gun advocate, ownership for civilians, is for that exactly unlikely thing, right? It's really unlikely that you're going to get home invaded. However, it has happened to quite a few people.
It happens to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people every single year.
It was happening. There was a rash of it in Philadelphia where 3 individuals were entering the home of elderly people with like revolvers or whatever. Now, it's unlikely that I'm going to be in a situation with multiple assailants, but it's going to happen to somebody, right? It's unlikely for you to be jumped by a couple of people, but it has happened to me, and that's And that's the thing. Like, however unlikely it is, it does happen. So on one hand, it's hard for me to say to myself, well, I'll call the police because it's unlikely that this individual is going to be hurt. So let me just go with the thing that's most probable. On the other hand, be like, well, I know it's unlikely for me to be attacked, but you got to provide me for the means for the, it's hard for me to hold both ideas in my head.
Yeah. It's a really uncomfortable dice roll all the time.
Yeah.
100% of your life, these dice are being rolled and someone loses. Like every minute of every day, someone loses in some way.
Yeah.
And it's really scary to think about. And I don't know. The only way, I'm not sitting here cowering behind a wall of guns and sandbags every single day.
Just weekends, right?
Just weekends. I sit in the fetal position with an AR-15 and cry, basically.
Just
waiting.
one AR-15? Crazy?
Well, there might be like 8 or 9. I build a fort out of them.
It's actually a wall of AR-15s and a sandbag you're holding.
Yeah, I'm holding the sandbag for comfort. It's a little gritty.
See, have you ever,
It's coarse and it gets everywhere.
what is it? You ever heard
Perfect.
that? You ever heard that thing where they're like, people say if every black man went out tomorrow and exercised his Second Amendment right and bought a firearm, there would be legislation the next day to limit the Second Amendment.
Doubt it.
Every time I hear
I
that,
think people who haven't actually talked to the people who strongly support the Second Amendment usually say that.
whenever I hear that, I go, I wish they would.
I really wish they would.
And of course, get proper training because, there's a shooting group that's open to everybody, but it's specifically for, I think, members of the LGBTQ community. It's called the Pink Pistols.
Yes.
And they're
They really took off after Orlando. They did a lot of good.
Their
really good
phrase is that armed gays don't get bashed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's right.
Yeah.
That is fucking right.
Yep.
And, I have been in a position where, in a physical altercation, in that moment, I was certain I was going to die, right? Like, I knew it. My life was over. Everything I'd done to that point was done. This was it. And, I look back on, like, the physical recovery from that event and all the other struggles, even through my generalized life struggles. There have been some unpleasant things. But the least pleasant moment of my life was that moment when I knew I was going to die there in a street, being beaten to death. And obviously I didn't, because here I am, but it was the most horrible thing.
Or did you?
Are you here?
Yeah, right?
He's a spooky ghost.
And,
It was a spooky ghost.
and I,
Ghosty ghost.
And I would certainly never use that as an argument as to why my opinion is right over anybody else's. I know that's like a appeal to emotion and it's not sound or whatever. But when I think about owning for personal protection, I think about, I'm a huge guy and it is unlikely that I would be in that situation. I think of Genevieve on the other side of the room at 5'3", who basically anybody who wanted to physically exert their will on her has the means to do so, unless they're a child or a dwarf.
My two biggest enemies.
I said except if they're a child or a dwarf, right? I did say especially. Okay, good.
Especially.
And like in my mind, that's what I see the purpose of firearms for personal protection. It gives her a means to say, no. Two people aren't going to punch my face in and stomp on me until I die. And I understand that there are a lot of bad things that come from that, that allowance. But my personal view is that there are a lot of different things that we could try to do to fine tune that so that people aren't dying from the tools that we have to protect ourselves. That's another thing that's hard for me to resolve. These people who are victims of gun crimes who don't have firearms themselves are in that position where they're like, holy fuck, like this is it. I don't have the means to protect myself. But this idea that we take away the ability of law-abiding citizens to protect themselves at all just seems scary.
Again, it comes back to blaming the. It's are we going to focus on the tool or are we going to focus on the people? And no It's already illegal for them to accost you. It's probably already illegal for them to have the gun, because if you look at the amount of people who actually commit gun crimes, it's pretty rare. Or I should say it's on the rarer side, where it's like, oh, illegally obtained. Usually the person's already in violation by having one, and they don't care. And somebody has to be able to look me in the eye and say, you can't have this, and I'm perfectly okay with the criminal getting it, but you can't have this. Then there's actually, integrity to what they're saying. Otherwise, it's just a pipe dream. The idea that you can disarm criminals, it's silly.
I had that conversation with somebody one time. Look at him in the face, and he goes, you know what? I don't care about you, and I don't care about your girlfriend. I don't care. I want the guns gone because the problems that they cause are bigger. And I was like, wow. Gotta hand it to you, dude.
Okay.
That was straight up. I mean, ooh,
and not to bring it all the way back around, but then the next step is, okay, there's 100 million, there's 100 million whatevers, and there's 300 million guns probably total. And we're going to spend the time and the effort and the personnel and the money and the manpower, and we're going to go door to door. We're going to get all of the guns. And you're going to tell me that's worth it versus just tracking down the handful of crazy guys. And if you want to tell me that's worth it, fine. I said, but that's what you're arguing for. It's not just, you can't pass a law, magically snap your fingers, and the guns disappear, and then the violence disappears. Violence is always going to be there.
Yes.
Or that everyone's going to voluntarily give up guns.
Yeah.
If you're not going to get them.
Yeah. That's one thing I never understood. That's the one thing that I don't get having this conversation with people. I'm like, can you imagine living in a world where, like, because I'm a huge man, and most people are, I'm like, where if I decided to harm you, there'd be nothing you could do about it. It blows my mind.
Well, there's tasers. It's the what ifs never end. But like it's funny, like you think some people say, well, what about the Australian gun buyback? And I say, okay, how many criminals did the Australian gun buyback disarm? 0. Nothing. It literally didn't do anything.
I think it didn't. A couple of people most people who turn in their guns had illegal guns via inheritance. Isn't that what was going on?
Yeah, they banned. I forget what the deal was, but like they made it basically impossible to afford certain guns that were being turned. Like the way their grandfathering worked is like you had to register and you had to pay something, and like people just were like, I don't have the money for it.
Right.
So, but that's the point, is that like, oh, all these people who were not a problem are now disarmed. Congratulations. What have you done? You've literally done nothing. You've taken guns out of the hands of the people who might actually stop tragedy, and done literally nothing for the people who commit these things.
Gee, as our greenest Second Amendment exerciser, I'm interested to see what kind of questions you have in your head after this whole discussion, especially for our guest that we...
I feel like I've asked most of my questions.
Yeah.
You might have to circle back.
Well, you're not screaming at me that I don't have blood on my hands and that I hate the children, because that's usually what happens.
Oh, okay, no.
So you're already a step ahead of half the debate out there.
No, like I don't own any guns. I've never been licensed. I just haven't done it. I wouldn't be opposed to going in and getting, what was it we were talking about, getting concealed carry for like a group deal if we can.
Well, not necessarily a group deal, but
we want to go.
A few of us going to the class together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
We just haven't found enough people, or the right time, right place, right.
It's actually pretty in depth to get licensed in the state that we're looking into.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that would work out. No, Delaware.
Okay, Delaware. Gotcha.
Because I think somebody was telling me there's you got to take an ad out in a paper or something goofy like that.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
I thought you just have to take a class.
That's what I thought, and that's what we were all going to do, was go take the class
were...
in Delaware. But there's somebody was explaining to me that there's more to it that you have to do. So it's not actually that simple to get licensed in Delaware. Like Pennsylvania's shall issue. You just go.
You literally walk into the county courthouse. At least that's how Chester County worked. I had mine in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and they check and make sure you're not a criminal, and that's it.
Yeah, it doesn't take that. It's not that bad in Pennsylvania.
How about you, Chris? Any sort of questions?
Well, I already have some of my knowledge. You've definitely got me to think about it differently, and
I'm glad to hear that.
and it makes a lot more sense now. It was more of that. I think I was just confused and torn about how I felt, but you put a lot of my thoughts into. It was more funneled down, and it made a lot more sense because it's a very dynamic issue. It's huge, and it's a lot to. I mean, even in the an hour and a half we've been going so far, that was a lot of information we covered, and it is a lot to marshal all of that. And I think you definitely explained a lot of it very well, and it makes a lot of sense given like the actual data and facts that's out there.
Yeah, I wish I had brought more of the ATF paperwork stuff with me and articles and whatnot. As for the actual data itself, it is out there.
Well, review some of that. I mean, you have the papers. It's not like we have a particular.
Yeah. This was actually an article from a couple weeks ago. It was like pretty much right after Parkland. It was in the Chicago Tribune, and basically the deputy ATF director basically said what I'm saying. He was focusing more on suppressors specifically and the 86 and 89 import bans, but it's nonetheless it's the same thing where it's why are we spending time and money and personnel and man hours and all kinds of things to do this when it has absolutely no effect other than to distract personnel from doing things like following up on the Parkland shooter type people and stuff like that. That's kind of what this was. I'm trying to remember. Too significant.
Yeah, were there any quotes in there that you wanted to?
Nothing particular. Yeah, I mean that's the other interesting part too is that I don't a lot of people, especially like FFLs, it's kind of a meme to hate on the ATF and ascribe horrible motive to them, and I think there's plenty of asshole ATF agents out there, but I don't think in general the average person especially who goes into law enforcement is looking to make your life miserable. And I think the ATF would much rather be busting bad guys and fighting gang crimes and stopping actual illegal gun trafficking and stuff coming up from Mexico and you name it,
The meme
measuring barrel lengths.
Yeah, the meme that I always hear about the ATF is that if they show up to your house, they shoot your dog. Like, the FBI can knock on your door, but the people will be like, "Oh, well, at least it wasn't the ATF because the dog's got to survive."
I've only ever heard of. I've heard that exact thing, but not the ATF specifically. It's cops in general.
Wasn't there that one time where the ATF busted into this dude's house because he had marijuana, and then they killed his one dog and shot the other?
Was that the ATF?
I think it was the ATF on this one.
I don't know.
I don't know, but it was bizarre to me. I'm like, wait a minute, there's a meme about the ATF?
Yeah.
Granted, I wasn't like a firearm subreddit.
John Wick teach us anything? You don't go shooting dogs. Don't show up and do that.
Because now mass killings like that become justified.
Oh,
because puppies.
Right.
38 people were killed. Yeah, well, yeah, but like one of them shot his dog.
Yeah, but
okay, it's fine.
But it was
right.
John Wick.
He's the man you called to kill the fucking boogeyman.
Who wins in a head-to-head, John Wick or Jesus Christ, Jason Bourne?
Jesus Christ, Jason Bourne.
John Wick
John
wipes
Wick.
the floor
yeah.
with Jason Bourne.
What?
Yeah.
You think?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
It's not even.
Jason Bourne is absolutely overrated with the incompetence of the characters that are written around him. That's why he gets away.
I think a more evenly leveled fight would be the guys from the raid against John Wick.
All of the guys from the raid, or just like
the what's
that's
his name? The protagonist from the raid. What's his name now?
Any individual, I would say, John Wick. As a team,
Ron Wick.
Ron Wick. Yeah.
Ron.
You think as a team? Because I mean, he's taken out.
As a team, I think you've got a good argument.
As a team, yeah. Because I mean, his whole movies, he's taken out squads, like of these fucking guys, these Russians.
All right. What else you got in your hands there?
This is an overview. This is stuff I pulled from mostly the ATF's website, and it has to do with the different types of things that are banned. I had stuff on the assault weapons ban in here in case we got to that discussion, which is
I am very curious about it.
The assault weapons ban, it all comes around basically to what is an assault weapon. And an assault weapon has a bunch of these criteria, things like a barrel shroud, but also if it has a barrel shroud and has a pistol grip, but also if the ammo is in front of the chamber. But if the ammo is in front of the chamber and it's a rifle, that doesn't mean as much as if it's the ammo in front of the chamber with a pistol, because then now it's like it's a complicated mess that makes these really weird looking firearms, and it basically it's another layer of bureaucracy, and a lot of people are saying, well, go back to that, and it's why because when the assault weapons ban was in effect, we had Columbine, we had all these other shootings, we had probably the worst of them in a lot of ways, and people just they insist on going back to that.
When was it in effect?
Assault weapons ban was from 96 or 90, I think it was from 94 to 94 to 04.
94
It was 94 to 04, yeah.
Okay.
Aw.
How?
Oh, it came out. It started in my birth year.
Oh my
Aw.
God.
Oh.
What a. Wait, so is there an actual definition for an assault weapon?
Yeah, I'm trying to find.
I thought that was like the big meme right now.
Well, it's because
No, there's
nobody,
no real
it's because nobody knows. It's different depending on who you ask. I mean, the assault weapons ban itself did have specific legal criteria, which led to, again, like I was saying, really weird looking firearms that weren't any less deadly. They just were more annoying. They also listed some things by name as assault weapons. So like the AR-15 and AK-47, I think it was the AK. No, it might not have been the AK, but it was like the Galil or something, and the Uzi were by name assault weapons, regardless of what configuration you put them in. So it's...
I am astounded that...
telescoping stock, pistol grip, bayonet mount, which apparently is relevant. Flash suppressor, but flash suppressor not like a silencer flash suppressor, but like anything that's like at the hooks onto the end of the barrel to like deflect the blast of the flash. That's considered a flash suppressor, even if it's one of those ones that makes it extra bright, like the compensators is still a flash suppressor.
Yep.
And for some reason they listed grenade launcher. And
Already covered as a destructive device.
Exactly. Or I think they were saying place to mount a grenade launcher was also one of the arguments. But really, you can mount a grenade launcher to anything if you are patient enough. So
Or have sufficient duct tape.
yeah,
I just can't believe that ever expired. Like, I really am of the mind that if you put these limitations on what...
They never go away, correct. We got very, very, very lucky with the assault weapons ban expiring. But the problem is that we still now have the 86 and the 89 import bans in the
There was also an argument that
NFA.
With the assault weapons ban that it would have needed to be in effect longer to produce any measurable results because there was so much stuff already out there in the market. But I kind of agree. Jesus, Bill.
Knocking all over. All
have
right.
a
Well, if he's
problem.
doing that, I'm pouring more wine.
All right. Well, I guess taking a food break.
Oh, well, they always want more. Well, if we tried this forever, we tried this for 50 years, then it would just be better. It's like no.
And I
It's not
agree
worth
that if you simply say that, the assault weapons ban had no effect, I agree that is both true and irrelevant because the ban. I share the opinion.
Effectiveness or not, it doesn't change my opinion on the assault weapons ban. I'm fundamentally
I
opposed
also
to
agree
it.
with that.
So
I think discussing the fact that it only lasted for so long and what impact that had therefore on violence, all of it's fucking moot. We just don't know. The point is I'm also of the opinion that it was a dumb idea.
yeah,
And bringing it back is a dumber idea.
it's kind of how I feel on. I should say more relevantly is how I feel on bump stocks. I think bump stocks are stupid.
Yep.
But I don't think they should be banned.
You can also do it without
What
them.
are those?
Correct. Bump stock. It's there's no spring in it, which a lot of people seem to think there's a spring. There's not supposed to be a spring. Basically, it's stock that attaches to also where you grip the rifle, and it slides back and forth. It's not 100% stable.
Okay.
So you hold the stock, and then with your left hand, or just suppose your right hand, the right hand's the trigger hand, and with the other hand, you pull forward on the gun, and you actually move the trigger towards your finger as opposed to moving the your finger towards the trigger. And then when your trigger, inevitably when the trigger's pulled because it's hitting your finger, the gun goes off, and then there's recoil. And because the stock is not solid, the gun slides back. But if you're pulling forward with your hand, then you go forward, and it creates this kind of fake mechanical motion where you just end up shooting a lot of stuff really fast, and you don't hit
as fast
anything.
as the gun will operate is as fast as you can fire it. And it
Correct, and also your odds of you causing a jam are very, very high.
yeah, it's a facsimile of fully automatic fire. And the bump stock thing, it's been around for years, but it came into prominence after the Las Vegas shooting, because which that's a whole other can of worms because of how little we know.
Little information on Vegas. That's
for
frustrating.
some reason.
How the hell do we not know? How do we not know?
I don't know, but to stay on top.
That baffles me.
Yeah. Baffles the suppressors, huh?
Guns jokes.
But that asshole in that hotel room had at least 1 or 2 firearms fitted with a bump stock, because his idea was he was just lobbing bullets at the crowd.
Yeah.
He didn't care. So high rate of fire is what he was after. Bump stock could fill that niche and did. But it wasn't. He had many other firearms that didn't have it.
He had. I mean, from the wounds they were describing, he had like multiple scoped 308s, and I was like, that's probably where a lot of the really nasty casualties were coming from.
Well, he was pushing the effective range of the smaller caliber stuff.
He also had a car bomb, but it didn't go off. And he tried to set off the jet fuel, but he at the airport it didn't go off either. So we got kind of lucky in Vegas, but it's.
And so, how many of those injuries were just tramplings?
They actually said there was no deaths caused by the trampling. They
good.
include the investigation, so people seem to evacuate kind of early.
Those videos were pretty rough.
Yeah, that was nasty.
I mean, people were recording in the middle of the firing, and it was just.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see people weren't like even sprinting away. Everyone was kind of like, "Oh, I guess I better jog away from this problem."
Just hearing little impacts and cracks, and you're like, "What the hell is this?"
It was
and then all of a sudden,
surreal.
like, people are bleeding. It's like, "Oh God."
Oh,
Yeah.
we are under attack.
Yeah.
One thing, and I'm not proposing anything here.
Mhm.
One thing that was interesting to me though is, we have no way of knowing. Do we have a way of knowing whether or not somebody left that room other than him?
Well, apparently the MGM's not doing a very good job of cooperating, and there's lawsuits, and probably they do know, but we don't know what course the investigation is taking. I know they made an arrest for somebody who sold him the ammo or something like that. Like there was an arrest recently, but like it's just bizarre. There's so many factors. It's hard to comment even on what's going on with
Was his door barricaded from the inside?
I don't know.
Because here's what I was curious about. Like, they said, all right, at some point he shot himself in the head and the shooting stopped. And then it was like 10 minutes until they breached the door after he stopped shooting or something. It was like a period of time.
Something like that. I don't know.
I was thinking to myself, could there have been a second person in that room who shot him and then left and we have no idea? I'm not proposing that there was.
No, that's true.
It's a conspiracy.
And then this is the asinineness of it. Like, by them being so tight-lipped, they're only feeding the conspiracies. Because I can't definitively say there wasn't a second person in that room, because we don't know because I don't know the evidence. I don't know anything. Nobody knows anything. Yeah. Vegas is such an outlier in terms of like.
Oh! I just remembered the thing that it wasn't. Do we not know if there was anybody else in the room? Do we even know if this guy actually fired those guns? That was the question I had. Is there anything that shows that he actually fired those weapons?
Well, they would be able to tell by the hands, but we haven't seen that evidence. No, I would assume so. They are saying he's the shooter, right?
Hiding stuff.
But they're also hiding a lot of stuff.
Ooh.
But that's the thing. It's frustrating because it's like, oh, I'm going to play down the conspiracies but I can't in this case because there's no solid information. So
it was bizarre.
Did they ever find out if he is actually British and part of the bigger conspiracy of the UK attack?
Brought it full, sir.
I I ate the bait on that one.
It took me a second.
Well,
Frigates are coming, I'm telling you.
We'll watch out for the Man
Hashtag
of Wars.
Frigates 2018.
The shores of Las Vegas.
Yep. They'll air them in, like drop them in.
A fleet of Man of War were parachuted into Vegas.
And they
From
just
space.
crash.
Explode everywhere. Well, ladies and gents, we have gone as long as one of our typical episodes at this point.
Oh my goodness gracious!
The better 2.5 and change. Almost 2.5 hours.
That went fast.
Yeah, it did.
I feel like we have so much more we could talk about.
We could keep going, but we do have a main episode to do.
Yeah, we do. Well, what if we just extend an open invitation anytime you want to come back and do episode 2 on this topic?
Whenever you guys want me, I will try to make myself available.
All right.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, hey, thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, Tim, for enlightening us and indulging in this conversation about a very, very serious topic for whatever jokes we had to make. My big takeaway from this and many other conversations like it is that this is not as simple as banning the problem away. Never mind our biases against bans. We do care about the results. We do care about people not getting hurt, and we care about getting the bad guys. There was a little bit of a circle jerk here in that we all are sort of on the same page. I think there wasn't a whole lot of challenge, and that's not a bad thing in and of itself.
I think in general everybody kind of wants the same thing, but it's we want to be safer and we want to be, we don't want our kids getting shot. I think we all kind of agree on that. It's just a lot easier when we all agree that we agree on that, because that seems to be where the conversation starts, and a lot of times where it's, well, I believe I want to protect the children, so I want to ban X, Y, Z, and then if you don't agree with me, you must hate the children.
Right.
And that's
non
Twitter.
sequitur.
Exactly.
My big thing is there's nothing wrong with being wrong and then learning that and changing your opinion. And I'm not excluding myself from that at all. I am wrong all of the time. See also Conversations with Frank. Specifically when I thought that average was not a colloquial definition but was actually mathematic, and he said, sorry bud, it's not. That was like a 25-minute rant on the definition of average and how George Carlin was wrong about it that I had to throw out the window, because it turns out he was totally right. And that's a lighthearted example, but I think the only way that we're going to move forward is for people to realize it's totally okay to be wrong and realize it and change how you think. And it's totally okay to have accept something that maybe logically your conclusion doesn't make sense, but you still you have a basis of morality that you feel compelled to stick to. I'll as long as it's recognized, right? If we sort of get more comfortable with knowing that we all have our own shortfalls, and we get more comfortable with opening communication and listening and asking questions and being wrong, we don't have to keep having the same conversations over and over again. A specific example of I cannot come to terms with the idea of limiting somebody's ability to protect themselves. I just can't do it. And there are a lot of ways I'm wrong about that, but just from my experience, I can't do it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to discredit anybody's opinion in here if they disagree with me. There is a solution. There are probably lots of solutions, or lots of small solutions to a big problem, but we got to work together. And if I got anybody riled up personally, that's not what I wanted.
Fax your complaints. 2 Guns No Ammo.
Yeah, I mean, we have an email, 2gunsnoammo@gmail.com. I'm willing to hear anybody's opinion, and I thank you for listening to us, because we're all trying to work the same direction, I think.
Well, hey, again, thanks everyone. We're going to take a break here, and then we're actually going to get down to the main event.